The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Hello and welcome to How We're the Podcast. It's Martin here, and you join us for yet another episode of On This Week, where we take a look back at some of the wonderful and not so wonderful things that have happened in the history of Sunderland Association Football Club. Today we are covering the week of October the 6th to the 12th, and predictably there is an awful lot to get stuck into. We've got no Kelvin with us this week, but the rest of the regular gang is here. So first of all, I will say hello to Andrew Smithson. Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Martin. It's a shame Kelvin's not here, but we'll try and have a good old chinwag anyway.
Well, somebody's going to have to take responsibility for some one-liners, aren't they? So I might have to share that responsibility.
Yeah.
We'll see. And of course, also joining us is Chris Wynn.
Hello, Martin. Yes, and I refuse to sing a song. I like to take Kelvin's place. He usually comes up and gives us a tune, but I am glad you said in the intro that there's some good and not so good, because potentially, and we haven't quite decided yet, but if we touch on one of the old Tyne Tees games, we might induce some nightmares in some people, certainly myself, whenever we saw us play on Tyne Tees. It was very rarely it was it good.
It used to make you wake up in a cold sweat when you realised that Sunderland were going to be on Tyne Tees on the Sunday and Roger Thames was going to be there narrating a downfall, wasn't it? But we've got to go into that now, haven't we? Well, Borough was always a very common hunting ground, wasn't it, for Tyne Tees? And Roger Tyne, as he became known, was was always overseeing proceedings. So Hallison days. We will start off, Andrew. You did a quiz question at the end of last week's episode, and we'll start off with that if you don't mind.
No, not at all. 9th of October. This future Sunderland player was born in Hendon, and it was a very simple one. Who is it? We went low in terms of clues because I thought a few people might have a decent stab at this. Do you know who I was thinking of, gents?
Well, I do, because you told us the answer before we started recording.
Talk about a peek behind the curtain. Yes, it was, of course, Jimmy Montgomery, who on Thursday this week turns 82. So, of course, many happy returns to Monty. Just an absolute colossus in Sunderland history. And although he was born in Hendon, he actually moved over the water to Southwick as quite a young boy. But just, he's the classic hometown hero, isn't he? More games for Sunderland than anybody else. He's got those famous moments in 73 and promotion in 64, but I think he was just consistently brilliant for us and very fortunate, I would say. I've met him a couple of times, very, very grateful to be able to say that. Just a lovely fella as well. Aye. As I say, many happy returns to Jimmy Monty, because he's probably one of the most famous, most well-liked men in Sunderland.
It certainly is. I remember doing a football coaching course. It must have been in the early 90s. And my mum was working at County Hall in Durham, I think, and she dropped us off at the sports centre at Meadowfield Sports Centre, I think. I just walk in, I'm here for the football coaching course, and I look up and it's Jimmy Montgomery behind the counter. Oh, just go around the back, son, there you go. And every day for 5 days that week. First thing I did in the morning was say hello to Jimmy, which was a very nice surprise.
Well, I've never been fortunate enough to be in his presence, but everyone who meets him says he's a fantastic fella. But it is interesting, though, Andrew, you saying that when you talk to people like Martin Smith, and we've had maybe Darren Holloway, we've had a couple of others who we've talked to in the past who came through the youth setup, and they said how tough Jimmy Montgomery was as a coach. Him and George Hurd apparently cracked the whip and got the young lads into shape, and almost kind of with military precision. But they said they were really tough coaches. But you can't imagine, from everything I've heard, you can't imagine.
Well, no, you're right, because he seems such a friendly chap. But I mean, fair play to him. It's not as if any young player is going to be able to come back at him and say, well, what do you know about professional football? Listen, son, I've had hundreds of games. I've done it all.
He can turn around and say, I've won the European Cup.
Exactly, yeah. So you're not going to give him much lip if you're like a young player trying to come through the ranks. But fair play to him if he was able to do that and yet still be highly spoken of by these lads. That says a lot. I just hope he was a little bit easier going on yourself there, Martin, when you were turning up at the leisure centre every morning.
He was fine with me. He recognised talent when he saw it. That was the thing.
Of course. Another thing I was going to say there. I mean, for me, I always associated him with growing up in Southwick, but he was technically born in Hendon. I mean, flipping heck, Hendon, what an influence it's had on Sunderland history. Race Carter, born there, Montgomery, born there. That's probably two of our greatest ever players. Our first games played on the Blue House field. I think James Allen's first educational post in Sunderland was at Hendon Board School. So, just a little shout up for the lads and lasses in Hendon as well. I know we play on the other side of the water now, but still a major part of Sunderland's history.
I was going to say, it's interesting actually when talking about his big save. Obviously, everyone talks about the '73 Cup final, but when I've heard him being asked about it a few times, and he obviously likes talking about it. He says he can't get enough of it, but at the same time, he always says that wasn't his best save.
Does he have a preferred choice then?
And I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but he always says that he picks out one, and for the life of us right now, I can't remember what it is. But he doesn't point to that as being his best ever save.
Well, it's a shame Kelvin's not here, because I know he was a good friend of Kelvin and always made sure he give him a wave in the boys' enclosure. Kelvin might have known the game. But if you haven't seen it, lads, or if anybody listening to this hasn't seen it, he makes a save in the '73 semi-final at Hillsborough that is absolutely stunning as well. The ball takes a deflection, so his weight is already going one way. And he's able to kind of like just stop his momentum and turn back and save it at the near post. That might be his favourite save, because that was stunning.
We probably need Kelvin for this one. I apologise to put it to you two lads, but do you know if he ever got close to, pushing for England on us? Because you look at the likes of Peter Bonetti and all that with the, 1970 and all that sort of stuff. You do wonder, was it because he was at Sunderland? Was it because we were in the second tier most of the time?
I don't know. I think he got called up for a couple of squads, and he might have played in one or two youth levels. But yeah, that would presumably be the only black mark against him, was that he wasn't always playing in the top flight, because anybody who saw him live couldn't speak highly enough of him. He sounded like a phenomenal goalkeeper.
Well, he played obviously for us for 17 years, and at the age of or 33, he left the club and had a spell on loan in Southampton, had a couple of seasons at Birmingham, and as Chris alluded to earlier, he had a year at Forest where, it was days before sub-goalkeepers were so commonplace in league football, but in European football, you had a sub-goalie. So for the European Cup final under Brian Clough, Monty got a European Cup winners medal. And the reason that we've kind of come on to that already, obviously the quiz question from last week with his birthday, but also on the 6th of October, which is the first date that we are covering this week, in 1976, he actually made his last appearance for Sunderland. So he played his 627th game in a League Cup tie, or a League Cup third round second replay at Manchester United. So that brought the curtain down on his career.
Just on that, because I've always found that a bit weird, and I'm just double checking now whether I'm right. But wasn't that? I've got a feeling it was Stoko's last game in charge or something as well.
It was all around that time. I remember when Ian McFarlane took over from Stoko, there was a bit of disgruntlement because I think Ian McFarlane seemed quite keen on breaking up the last of the 73 cup winning team. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was around then.
I've just double checked, and so in that game against Manchester United on the 6th, that Martin said, Jimmy Montgomery played his last game because the next game against Aston Villa at Roker Park, he dropped Montgomery and put Barry Siddle in goal. So Montgomery had been in goal the start of that season. Obviously, it didn't start well. I think we won once in the first, 8 league games, and then got knocked out of the cup by Manchester United. But almost, it's quite a sad thing, actually, with how it played out, because Bob Stoko's last act was to almost end Montgomery's career at Sunderland, which is just as when I saw that, when I was looking through it, it's a bizarre thing that had happened that way. And he put Siddle in goal for his debut the next game, then got sacked after that. And of course, we got beat in that Aston Villa game. So, but yeah, it's almost a sad thing the way it played out like that.
It is, but it was a glorious career and still the record appearance holder for the club. We'll go back to 1926. On the 6th of October, Sunderland was still at the top of the table and won 7-1 at home to Burnley. Now, 2 players got hat-tricks that day. Dave Halliday, who we've talked a lot about in previous episodes. But there's another fella called Steve Coughlin got a hat-trick. And I don't know if either of you two know much about him, but he's a name I haven't really come across before. But yeah, he got 3 goals in the 7-1 win. 1962, Brian Clough scored a couple against his future club Derby as Sunderland beat them 3-0 at Roker Park. 1966 was the birthday of Niall Quinn, obviously former Sunderland player, manager, chairman, international. What was he? He was. I've just written a piece about this for the website for Friday. After he left the club as chairman, he was appointed as head of international business development or something like that for a very short-lived period under Ellis Short, but yes, practically did every role available at the club. 1979, our podcast friend John Hawley, no, it's a different one, centre forward John Hawley, scored a hat-trick on his league debut in the 4-0 win at home to Charlton Athletic. Or 4-0, I'm going to do that again, 4-0 home victory over Charlton Athletic. That sounds better. 1984, we drew 2-2 at Sheffield Wednesday. Now, 2 people with Sunderland connections put Sheff Wed 2-0 up in the first half. Lee Chapman, a former Sunderland player, scored the first one. And the second goal was scored by Brian Marwood, who I always really fancied at one point. He would come to Sunderland and play. Obviously, he'd never played for us, but he was a well-known Sunderland supporter. Had a very good spell with Arsenal and won the league with Arsenal when Michael Thomas scored that goal at Anfield. I always hoped Marwood would come and sort of see out his playing days with Sunderland, but he never arrived. Paul Atkinson and Clive Walker scored to make it 2-2 for Sunderland. I think Marwood's had a pretty long career in sort of sports administration. I think he was at Man City for a while and part of the City group and stuff like that.
Yeah. And obviously the other link there, Martin, manager of Sheffield Wednesday that day, was a certain Howard Wilkinson.
Oh, Howard Wilkinson. There we go.
Yeah.
I was a little bit early with them. Oh, well, Len Ashurst was probably our manager at that point, former Sheffield
Yeah,
Wednesday.
he was. Yeah.
Former Sheffield Wednesday manager. Yes, Howard Wilkinson, who we will come back onto later on in this podcast.
See what I did? See what I did there, Martin?
Seamless, mate. Seamless. I think we've just put everybody off. We've said we're going to be talking about horror shows on Tyne Tees and Howard Wilkinson.
Well, it is. Well, it's a bit early for Halloween, isn't it? But almost.
Well, we're approaching it. You can kind of tell it's in the air. 1990. Now, this was a game at Aston Villa, at Villa Park. And Sunderland obviously being promoted the season before after Swindon's misdemeanours. We got beat 3-0. Now, this is a memorable game for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's that game where Tony Norman let the ball slip through his hands. I think it was Tony Daly had a shot. And Tony Norman kind of looks as if he'd caught it and just trickled through his hands. And I guess that's the only little criticism you could have of Tony Norman. He was prone to one of those every now and again. There was obviously the famous one, Sheffield Wednesday in the FA Cup. But also a young lad called Anthony Smith, a left-back, made his debut that day. And he's a player who could have gone on to achieve an awful lot, I think, at Sunderland, but for a cruel injury a couple of years later. Any memories of him?
Well, I must admit, I'd slightly confused him with Paul Williams as another peek behind the curtain. You two lads saved me from embarrassing myself because it was Paul Williams who played, I think, around that time. He made his debut against Manchester United. But Anthony Smith was a really highly rated player. And as Martin says, I think it was just injuries that stopped him having more of a career at Sunderland. He was with us for a canny few years. And the thing I always kind of connect him to in my mind is his younger brother. I think there's a bit of an age gap, but his younger brother played for us in the Stadium of Light era. So that's quite a nice little story that the two lads from the same household have spanned two periods in Sunderland history.
Yeah. My memories, I mean, I remember him breaking through and coming through during this season. And if you look, you can see the faith that Dennis Smith had in him. And I've talked a lot about the amount that Dennis Smith brought through players. I mean, God, you could rattle them off. Your Richard Orr, Brian Atkinson, Warren Oak, David Rush, Kieran Brady, Paul Williams, like you mentioned there. I mean, you could kind of go on and on with the players he had to bring through from the youth setup. And to make his debut at this point in the season, you look at this as a kind of a pivotal point in the season because we started off quite brightly. We lost, and I've actually just wrote recently some on this days about the Everton game and the Wimbledon game that we lost leads at both of those. And I think we lost the lead on something like 11 occasions, might have been more this season. And we did at Chelsea, I think we did at Everton, we did at Wimbledon. Because after we got off to that flying start with draws against Spurs and Man United, we thought we were kind of flying and we went on this bad run. And to throw them into a game like this, away to Aston Villa, where you've got wingers like Tony Daly and stuff like that running at you, you can see the faith that they put in him. And he played 9 league games in the first division in this season after his debut in early October, like we're saying. And I always remember because like my brother was always, he's older than me, but I always remember him talking to his mates that in the years after this, and they were always waiting. Almost, it was kind of like, oh, we've got Anthony Smith to come through, and it was going, oh, we really like Anthony Smith, he's brilliant, but it just never happened. It was always like they were waiting for it to happen, waiting for him to get that run in the team, waiting for him to really kind of kick on, and it never really happened. And talking about this game as well, that season, and I mentioned about us kind of losing leads that season, but this was pretty much, and I was trying to have a flick through in terms of the league. It was only once or twice really that season we got absolutely thumped. And this was one of them where we were just kind of completely outplayed and looked out of our depth. There was the Man United game that you talk about. We got thumped at Leeds later on in the season. But this was one of the very few times we took a real hammering that season. It wasn't quite to the extent of the Mick McCarthy season, but remember that season with Mick McCarthy where we were in games for about 3 months or something at the start of the season before we downed tools. But with this season, we were pretty much in every game and had a chance of, times claiming all 3 points. Famous one away to Spurs at White Hart Lane. But yeah, it was one of them that I was a bit too young to kind of realise how good he was, I think. But I remember hearing older people than me going, we can't wait for him to really break through because he's going to be brilliant for years. And it just never happened for him.
No, he was fantastic, and I'm a little bit older than you, not much older, but just a
I see you're up on that, man.
Just a year. I thought I'd step into it. But he was a really, really talented football player, and he just suffered badly with injuries. I think he picked up a few injuries that were kind of sort of normal, I guess, for a young player who's coming into professional football and stepping up into that, tougher, more physical sort of proper men's football, I guess. But there was a game at Roker Park a couple of seasons later. I think he'd been in and out of the squad through injury. He hadn't played much, but he'd come in and played. I think he played a couple of games with Terry Butcher and looked superb. You kind of go, he might have been 21, 22 at this point. You go, now's the time. He's going to really kick on and do it. And I remember it was a game against Bristol City. I'm sure Dennis Smith was their manager. So Dennis Smith had given him his debut at Aston Villa, was manager of Bristol City at this point. And very early on in the game, we were attacking the Fulwell end, and Smith went down the wing just in front of the clock stand seats at the Fulwell end. And this brute of a right back for Bristol City, Andy Llewellyn, crocked him. Bloody awful tackle. And he got booked. And it's one of those, like today would have been a certain red card. And yeah, Smith came off injured, and that was pretty much him. He did play, we were just looking earlier, he did come on in one of Peter Reid's earlier games when Peter Reid came in. He came on as a sub in that game against Swindon. Martin Smith scored the only goal of the game, and that was a game that, of course, kept us up, or sealed us staying up. And Anthony Smith came on, I think, as sub for Richard Ord after about 20 minutes, played centre-half that game. He got released at the end of that season. He went to Northampton and played a couple of games, but that was kind of it, and that was him done. So, for a lad who was so talented, I think he's maybe, 23, 24, and packed it in. So, real shame. Really, really good talent. And, we talk a lot about people like Kieran Brady and stuff like that, quite rightly, in terms of the talent that we had around that time, players who didn't quite make it for, primarily injury reasons. But you'd put Smith in that bracket, but he doesn't get talked about too much because he was a defender.
Yeah, well, we're talking about Paul Williams. He was highly rated as well, but the Man United game pretty much finished him. I think he started the season after. I think we started off against Derby at home, I think, and I think Paul Williams started that, but he just kept coming in and out. But the point I was going to make was, if you look at all those players coming through, me and you've talked about this in the past, Martin, but if you look at the likes of Gary Hours, Gordon Armstrong, you could potentially throw Richard Ord in there, maybe Kieran Brady, David Rush, maybe. You talk about later on where managers protected young players. I mean, we're talking about Gordon Armstrong. I think, what was it, 89-90 season? He's probably, he's 20, 21, something like that. Played about 60 games in a season. I mean, you'd never have a 20, 21-year-old now playing 60 games in a season. I mean, look, Gordon Armstrong would be the first to say, well, I wanted to do that, and doesn't have any regrets of playing week in, week out, Saturday, Tuesday, Saturday, or whatever it was. But, you look at how many games all those young players played, it would never happen in the modern game. No. And I'm not saying, Anthony Smith's injuries might have been more down to that tackle and an actual, an injury on the pitch rather than, breaking down because he's played too many games. But it was a pattern, and it was kind of needs must from Dennis Smith because he didn't have the funds to do it. So we brought all these fantastic players through, and he didn't have the funds to buy a player in midfield. So Brian Atkinson, the likes of them were brilliant. But you look at their careers, and you look at by the time they get to 23, 24, 25, and you see them tail off. None of them really kicked on. They looked fantastic. I remember reading last week when I was doing research for this, comments from George Graham in this season we're talking about, when we went to Highbury and David Rush was brilliant. And George Graham was saying he's fantastic. Defenders can't relax when he's around. And these all had early promise where they looked brilliant. Warren Hawke played in the playoff semi-final at St James's Park, was brilliant on that left-hand side. But like I said, they play so many games that their second half of the career, all of those players were never as good as that start. They never kicked on. And you do wonder if there's a correlation between how much they were played early on.
It's probably a number of factors to chuck in, isn't there? I think the lifestyle aspect wasn't as kind of well understood and managed by youth team coaches at that point. And I think there was probably an awful lot of just almost like survival of the fittest, wasn't it? You just go out, you play, and if you come through, you've looked after yourself. If you haven't, tough shit, really.
Yeah. And in that era, there's an element of I've made it, right? I can go out now and have a few beers because I'm there. I've done the hard work.
And there's no camera phones or anything to catch you out, so you didn't have to be.
Those are the days, I tell you. Take me back.
Take you back, indeed. 3 years after this, and this always kind of seems a different sort of, a really different sort of section in Sunderland's history. But 3 years after that, Terry Butcher was our manager. And this was probably the high point of Terry Butcher's reign at Sunderland. Now, we already mentioned Howard Wilkinson once on this date. Howard Wilkinson was the manager of Leeds United as Terry Butcher, and they were in top flight, by the way. We were second division. Terry Butcher took Sunderland to Elland Road in the League Cup for the second leg of a League Cup tie. We'd beaten Leeds 2-1 at Roker Park, and we went to Elland Road and we turned them over again 2-1. Don Goodman and Phil Gray getting both of those goals. And I remember that being a really big thing. That was a point where I thought, actually, Terry Butcher's going to do it. Terry Butcher's, the new signings have all settled in. He's put his own stamp on the team. We're going to do something here. And we didn't.
Yeah.
Oh, we didn't that night. We didn't that night.
Yeah. It was so strange, wasn't it? The beginning of that season with, because Dennis Smith, we all wanted Dennis Smith to be given a chunk of money to spend, because that squad was almost the same one as Dennis Smith had kind of 3 or 4 years earlier, bar 1 or 2. You could look at some individuals, but that squad stayed together for far too long just because we didn't have the money. And then Terry Butcher just so happens by chance and by luck to be the one to get all that money. And then they're all involved in a car crash, except I think Alec Chamberlain was the only one who wasn't on the way back from Middlesbrough. I think we talked about that, didn't we, in previous episodes. But and then we got smashed at Derby County on the first day of the season, which I think we mentioned as well. We talked about that as well. But you're absolutely right that, and it's funny, you talk to a lot of the players like your Gordon Armstrongs, your Gary Howers and Don Goodman and Phil Gray as well. And you speak to them and you say that why could that squad never really do it? Because there were some really good players in that squad who proved themselves, as soon as Peter Reid took over, which was almost the same team, that, Peter Reid took them to the Premier League and won the title in his first full season. And none of them can put their finger on it. That all of them are just saying, we don't know. And, you go back to this summer as well, talking about the players coming in. And I think you've mentioned before, Martin, one of the biggest problems he made, and actually Terry Butcher wrote in his book about this, his biggest mistake he made. He transfer listed like 5 or 6 players, thinking he was going to trim the squad down, get some money in. And he said no bids came in for them, even though teams had been watching Gary Howers, Armstrong and the likes the season before. And actually Anthony Smith was one of them, I think, that he put on the transfer list, if I remember rightly. And I'll check in his book if he is one of them. But I think it was Peter Davenport was one of them, and there was a few others. And he stuck them all on the transfer list to try and get some money, and they stuck around. So he basically said, "You're not part of my plans." And then a few weeks in, he started to bring them in back into the fold. But it's games like this, Martin, that you mentioned, and at the start of the season after we got thumped off Derby, which was a bit of an achievement in itself because our first home game we came back and thumped Charlton Athletic 4-0. And Don Goodman scored. Mickey Gray scored, Sean Cunningham and Gordon Armstrong.
Lee Power was magnificent that day, man.
Yeah, Lee Power. Well, this thing, because Phil Gray, and we spoke to Phil Gray on the podcast a few years ago, and he said not many people realised how serious that car crash actually was and how badly he was injured. Yeah. Because he was out for quite the first couple of months of that season. But he said he came back a bit too early, and it really shook him up mentally as well. Because he was thrown out of the front of the car. He was thrown through the windscreen. And he said it really, really shook him up. But yeah, this, and I will kind of caveat that before I hand it back to you lads, that these 2 games, we were brilliant and we stepped it up. And like you say, I was like you, Martin, that I thought we've cracked this, beaten Leeds twice. Terry Butcher's going to get it right. He signed all these players. But you have to remember that the way that Howard Wilkinson played, the year before this, or the 2 years before this, the the back pass rule came in and it completely screwed Howard because they won the title the summer when that got introduced. So they were league champions, and you saw the drop off the next season because he had players who just couldn't play at the back and were kind of they couldn't turn around and just knock it back to the keeper. And it's funny actually. I was watching the other day for some reason when I went down a rabbit hole. The end of the 1992 European Championships final with Denmark and Germany.
Oh yeah.
The last 10 minutes was just Denmark knocking it back to Peter Schmeichel. So the back pass came in, and Leeds weren't quite as good as that. They took some time to adjust to that, but they still had good players. But yeah, 2 brilliant wins, and this probably gained Terry Butcher a little bit more time than he probably deserved from listening to what the players thought behind the scenes.
As Martin says, around the time of those 2 cup ties, we actually had a bit of form. We were doing all right in the league as well. We were picking up points. It's only after the next round where we have that famous game against Villa, where we played really well but still somehow managed to lose 4-1. That is what kickstarts the terrible run that brings Butcher's reign to an end. So you go from, as Martin says, September time, maybe things are starting to click under Butcher. We could be doing something here. By early November, he's away. And I think, like you say, Chris, sometimes some players couldn't quite put their finger on it as to why it didn't work under Butcher. But there are 1 or 2 as well who seem to think his man management skills were severely lacking. I think that was perhaps one of the issues.
Yeah, Gary Hours just almost didn't want to speak to him when we spoke to him on the pod. He couldn't stand the fella. And, and Martin Smith as well, he said about his debut against Luton, which was 2 games before that Villa game, where it was his debut and, 19 minutes in, there's a free kick in front of the full end. And he said, it kind of sums it up that because you were saying we were doing all right around that time, which on paper, looking at the results we were, but he said, he was a young lad making his debut. He said 19 minutes in, there's a free kick in front of the full end, and basically he's looking around and nobody's kind of stepping up to the ball to take it. And he's like, this young lad making his debut, and he says, well, I'll take it then. And he basically then he kills it into the corner. But he said it was that kind of disorganized and like, haphazard the way it was done. And I've heard Lee Howie talk about when he came in, because Terry Butcher was a big influence on him at Ipswich. And then he said, as soon as he started, like Terry Butcher moved up to manager and he started training them, he said all he did in the summer was run them. And he said, but everybody couldn't stand the manager. I think there was a story where they got ran so much and they were told to run along the seafront or something. And a couple of the players jumped on the E6 and nipped ahead of the rest of them. They were waving to the rest of them on their way past or something like along the seafront while the others was running. But he got them to run up the ski slope at Silksworth and all that, and he just said not all the players weren't having them in that summer, and I think the writing was on the wall, really.
Yeah, it was, and I think the weekend before that Luton game that you talked about, Chris, was a game against Middlesbrough on Tyne Tees, and we got stuffed. So if you're going to join a few little dots up as we go along, that was the case, but. Yeah, the 2 Leeds games set us up for that Aston Villa game, which we might talk about in a future episode.
Yeah, but just quickly, because we had the Gates Gabardini thing, this was the birth of the next generation of the G-Force, wasn't it? The Phil Gray and Goodman. And I mean, to be honest, I was that young kid at the time who just thought, these are going to fire us to the top flight and these are going to be brilliant. Big money signings. Because Phil Gray was, 750, 800,000, something like that. Don Goodman about 850,000. For that, I mean, that was massive money at the time for Sunderland. Huge money. And to have those strikers who banged them in for other clubs in what was Division 1 at the time, you just thought, these 2 are brilliant. I mean, they were kind of heroes, weren't they?
You know what? I actually think they were. I think they were really good strikers, both of them. And I think they both kind of proved it at Sunderland and at other clubs. And when you look at the midfield that we had behind them, right? You had Derek Ferguson played in this Leeds game. Kevin Ball, Gary Hours, Gordon Armstrong. That's a good midfield. So, there's no reason why that shouldn't have really clicked. But, it just didn't.
Like's being suggested, though, if they're not getting any tactical instructions for him, and that it's no good being fit as a fiddle if you don't know what your game,
right,
what you're expected to do on the pitch. Phil Gray, Butcher was desperate to bring him in that summer. He kept going in for him. I think Luton were in financial difficulties, so in the end agreed to a bit of a cut price deal. But yeah, Phil Gray was pretty hot property. He really pushed to get him. I definitely remember players saying that Butcher came in, he was this England hero, he'd won trophies wherever he played. So they were expecting this guy to be like at the forefront of tactics and all this type of thing. And they just couldn't get their head round it. Do you remember that awful day when we survived relegation at Notts County despite getting absolutely gubbed?
I was there.
Well, as you were making your way back to your bus or to your car, the story from several players is that Butcher came in, they were all expecting to get a rocket sent up them, and he just sat in the corner and started almost crying. They just were not expecting Butcher to be the type of personality he was. They thought he was going to be like getting hold of them and rousing them. So just didn't fit.
Yeah, there was a good thing with Leigh, how he said I'm sure that day he wasn't in the squad, but he on the coach, he basically said he gave the squad a rollicking like he was a fan. He started laying into them on the coach. And the other thing, just after that game, Terry Butcher wrote in his book that he was thinking twice about whether to stay on. He wasn't sure whether to actually take the job on. And his assistant, if you remember, was Mountain Crosby's assistant, Bobby Ferguson, who basically brought Butcher in the first place and had him at Ipswich. And Bobby Ferguson turned around him in the summer. He said, "I've had enough." He went, "This squad isn't good enough." And he says, "We're not going to be able to do anything with them." And after that, he thought, I thought twice about taking it on. And then he brought in Ian Atkins as his number 2 and went again. But so you could maybe argue, was he all in? Was he really sure he could do the job? But he tried to basically just rip it all up, sell off the squad, buy, completely new players. And, Martin mentioned Derek Ferguson. I mean, on his day, what a player. He was probably, on his day, he was probably too good for the first division, but because he had problems, and I think that the Paul car crash might have been part of that, he unfortunately never showed how good he was, because Rangers fans, will see how good he was, and he was, like I said, when you saw him play, I think actually in the friendly against Rangers, he was brilliant up there.
Superb.
Yeah.
No, he absolutely was. It's a funny one with Butcher, isn't it? Because he described that personality that he allegedly showed after the Notts County game. And he'd been a teammate of all these lads for the first half of the season. And I think we were trying to do, because Newcastle had appointed Kevin Keegan, and they'd seen the buzz that had sort of created around the club and around the Northeast. I think this was Bob Murray's kind of attempt at doing that, but on the cheap. But to be fair to Butcher at the time, you're talking it was only 2 or 3 years previously, been playing the World Cup in the semi-final in the World Cup that captured everyone's imagination in the country. He was leading the fans cheering and all that. He was leading the players. And, he captained England for the vast majority of that tournament because Brian Robson got it done his Achilles against Holland, I think it was. You know, the funny story about that, on that was a Saturday night game. Sorry, this is a complete random aside. On the Saturday night, England played the Netherlands and Brian Robson did his Achilles. On the Saturday afternoon, I'd been down the Metro Centre and bought a new pair of shin pads from Monument Sports, and they were Robson Gold. And the fella who was talking us through the different shin pads, he goes, "And these ones have a special Achilles protector bar down the side, so it'll really look after your Achilles." Bought them. I think I might have even had them on watching the match. And, Brian Robson did his Achilles tendon.
Because actually, you mentioned the World Cup as well. It was like just before that, of course, it was the famous, because when we qualified, Butcher was covered in blood, wasn't he? Was it against Sweden, I think, from memory?
Yes, I think it was.
But yeah, so there was that famous picture. So he was this kind of warrior, from England, and he failed at Coventry, which put a little bit of a cloud over it as player manager. But yeah, and he was doing all that. But as a player the season before, he was doing all that kind of orchestra with the crowd. I remember at Hillsborough when we got knocked out of the FA Cup, he was doing it and all that. And but I also remember him getting done by Julian Georgian when he had a 30-yard head start on him, which was also on Tyne Tees, I think, if I remember rightly.
There's every chance. Right, we will move on. 2002 on the 6th of October. We're still only on the first day of the week. We got beat away at Arsenal 3-1. Kanu scored 2 goals very early on. Tommy Sorensen got injured. He went off. It was 3-0 at half-time. Jody Craddock pulled one back later on for Sunderland, but that was Peter Reid's last game as manager. 2003, Joe Baker, who is another person we've talked about now and again on this podcast, he passed away. And 2018, Sunderland, now really getting the glory days here, Sunderland beat Bradford away 2-1 in League One. Josh Madger and Jack Baldwin scored the goals. John McLaughlin saved a penalty. And I thought this was interesting to include because Max Power, who is now at Bradford, was sent off after 66 minutes. We will take a short break there. We will be back very soon.
This episode is presented by State Farm. Having insurance isn't the same as having State Farm. It's like expecting the leadership of a team captain on the football field, but getting a sea captain. You wouldn't settle for just anything for your team. Shouldn't it be the same for your insurance? So don't settle for just any insurance when you can go with a leader. State Farm. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
No one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
Welcome back to How Are the Podcasts, and you join us for another episode of On This Week. And we are going to recommence this one on the 7th of October. Now, 1899, Sunderland played their one and only league game, one and only visit to a team called Glossop North End. Now, I think we mention Glossop in relation to Joe Butler last week, who we signed Joe Butler from.
Part of the 1913 league winning team, wasn't he?
Yeah, so that's right. So yeah, very early 1900s. But yes, we played our one and only game at Glossop North End, and we beat them 2-0 in that game. 1911, a chap called Robert Best scored in his debut in a 3-0 home win over Aston Villa for Sunderland. 1964, Paul Stewart was born. In 1982, Jermaine Defoe was born. Now, in 1995, Sunderland won at Crystal Palace. David Kelly scored the goal for Sunderland, but we missed 2 penalties. I think it was Martin Scott and Paul Bracewell, missed on that occasion.
I think everybody had a pop at a penalty around that time, didn't they? We missed a few.
I think we were taking lots, weren't we? You see who's going to be the next unfortunate person to step up. 2002, obviously the day after that Arsenal game that we talked about before the break, Peter Reid's tenure at Sunderland was brought to an end by Bob Murray. He was sacked. Now, I remember I'd finished work and I'd driven I was at the gym in Leeds. What gym was it? Fitness First, I think. I was on the treadmill and it came up on Sky Sports News that Peter Reid had been sacked. And David O'Leary was a favourite to replace him at that point. We will come on to that story because there is more to talk about there. With 2007, Sunderland played Arsenal at Highbury again. And Ian Hart made his debut. Oh, it would have been at the Emirates, wouldn't it? Sorry.
It was at the Emirates,
yeah. We were 2-0 down. We got back to 2-2. Ross Wallace and Kenwyn Jones scored, but Robin Van Persie scored with 10 minutes left to make it 3-2. Paul McShane was sent off for 90 minutes, and for whatever reason, Roy Keane decided to bring Ian Hart on to try to rescue the game at that very late stage. I want to take you back, though, to 1916, this one, and I'm going to do a little bit because Kelvin's not here to do something today. But I want to talk about a goalkeeper called Leigh Richmond Roose. And 1916 is the day that is down as his day of his passing. He was a goalkeeper who was born in 1877. He's raised in a little village outside Wrexham. And he was came from a very middle-class family. His father was a church minister. His mother had passed away when he was a young lad, I think 2 or 3 year old. But he'd gone to a private school. And when he was at this private school, among the teachers that he had was H.G. Wells. So you can kind of get a sense of the background and upbringing this lad had. He went to Aberystwyth University. He studied science. He started playing goal when he was at Aberystwyth. I can't even say it. Aberystwyth. Whatever I said before, where the university was, he played for a football club there. But his plan was to become a doctor. He finished university, moved to London, and he got a job at King's College. And he was about to start his Bachelor of Medicine degree to qualify as a doctor. But Stoke had been watching him play for that football club in Wales, I couldn't say. They really interested in taking him on. Now, he's already sort of got this reputation of being a really, really good goalkeeper, but he's quite outlandish and quite a standout. You know, he'd perform gymnastics on the crossbar when the ball was at the other end of the field. He'd turn around and have the crack with the fans behind the goal, telling them jokes and all this sort of stuff. And prior to him starting to play in goal, goalies were just, there to save the ball. They were shot stoppers. And, this was an era where they would get, really treated badly by forwards. They'd get punched and trampled and kicked all over and shoulder charged and stomped on and all that sort of stuff. And, playing in goal it's not like it is today where you're overly protected. It was a really, really tough position to play. At that time, we talked earlier about the back pass rule coming in, which sort of scuppered Howard Wilkinson. But this time, goalkeepers were allowed to handle the ball anywhere in their own half. So they could run out with the ball if they wanted to, out of the goal, but hardly any of them dared because they were going to get into such sort of physical confrontations. They just didn't bother. But Leigh Richmond Roose was, or Roose, and there's a story about that, which I'll come on to. But he was a big, strapping, physical fella. So he could actually run with the ball and bounce the ball and run upfield to the halfway line, almost like a rugby player was. He had the build where people would bounce off him and he could really handle himself. And because of the way that he was doing that sort of stuff out of the goal, they actually changed the rules in 1912, and this is towards the end of his career. So goalkeepers could only handle the ball in the penalty box, and he was the reason why. So we've talked again a few times about different things that have happened where Sunderland players or people who've been or played for Sunderland in the careers have influenced either changes of strategy, changes of routines, changes of centre-halves going up for corners and stuff like that. This was an example of where a Sunderland player has actually caused a rule change because he was so good at doing that, kind of gave the team he was playing for a bit of an unfair advantage. But this fella, when you read about him, he was a good-looking, suave, sophisticated player. He's described as football's first superstar. So he's been described as having the playing style of Peter Schmeichel, the attitude to life and partying like George Best, but also the media sort of savvy sense of David Beckham. He was on the front page of the newspapers. Now, you've got to remember back in those days, there's no internet, there's no TV. Newspapers are it. If you're on the front page of the newspapers, you are something special. You're a star, or you've done something terribly, terribly bad. He was somebody who was always in the press. He was regarded as football's biggest superstar, and he had a bit of a reputation with the ladies as well. There was a music hall star called Marie Lloyd, and she sang the song, which I wish Kelvin was here because he could sing it. My old man said, "Follow the van." I think there's been a few football iterations of that song over the years, but she sang that. And even though she was married, her and Leigh Richmond Roose kind of got together, and they were described as the Posh and Becks of the day. They were on the front page newspapers, two massive stars. It caused a real sort of media storm. The Daily Mail in 1905 listed Roose as London's second most eligible bachelor behind the cricketer Jack Hobbs. When the paper invited the readers to vote for the best players in the world, what's your best world 11, he was voted the best goalkeeper in the world by an absolute landslide. So he had all of these things going on. Now, the really interesting thing about him was that because of his background in medicine, this was at a time where the FA were taking football professional. but there wasn't a ban on being an amateur playing professional football. So he stayed as an amateur because he could earn more money through obviously supplementing his income through work. So he worked at King's College London for large parts of his career during the week. But also because of he could put in really massive expenses claims as an amateur, which professional players weren't allowed to do. So he'd put in huge expenses claims. Now there was a story where he was playing for Stoke and they were playing Aston Villa away, and he'd missed his train from Euston to get up to Villa. So he hired his own train and carriage, and he sent the bill of £31 to Stoke to cover his fees. Now, at this time, a miner's salary would be £1.03 a week. So this was almost an annual salary at the time. So you can kind of see how big the expense was. And when he was at Sunderland, he was still an amateur at Sunderland. So he played for us later on in his career. He was still an amateur at Sunderland, and he was actually investigated by the FA because of the amount of expenses he was being paid. But the clubs who employed him knew it wasn't actually against the rules to do this. It might have been against the spirit of things, but it wasn't technically against the rules. And there was the school of thought was, well, if we're paying him £1,000 in expenses, which was kind of the figure that was rumoured for him to be getting paid. Now, again, if you consider that the average salary of a miner would have been 52 quid a year, if he's getting £1,000 in expenses, there's a huge amount of stuff going on there. But they were thinking, well, we're going to get £2,000 extra through the gate. So it all kind of works out. But the FA really disliked him, both for his off-the-field shenanigans and his persona and his profile. And also he was kind of almost like a beacon for staying amateur whilst playing professional sport because he could do it. Now, when the war broke out, because he'd been playing for Sunderland from 1908 to 1910, he'd played 98 times for us. When it came to the war, obviously war broke out in 1914, he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he'd never actually completed his medical degree, but because of his medical background, he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, served in France and Gallipoli, and he was kind of thinking he would serve his time out like that. He wasn't going to fight, but then he came back to London. He transferred to the 9th Royal Fusiliers, and he earned a military medal for an event that happened where he was fending off a flamethrower attack on his unit, and he didn't have a gun to do this, and it's described as he was using his goalkeeper skills to defend his unit from these flamethrowers that were going on. And he actually won a military medal for that. He's promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal. But on this day, so the day that we are talking about, 7th of October 1916, he was killed during an Allied attack on German lines. And his body was never actually found, but he's commemorated by the Thiepval Memorial in northern France, which is a monument to 72,000 British and South African soldiers who have no known grave. So I've always been fascinated with this fella. Now, I read a fantastic book. It's called Lost in France, The Remarkable Life and Death of Leigh Richmond Roose, football's first playboy, by a chap called Spencer Vines. And what was interesting, which I made a comment about earlier, I said Rouse, and he was actually enlisted for one of his army posts with a misspelling of his name. It was misspelled R-O-U-S-E, and I think that took an awful long time in the subsequent years after his death to connect the corporal, the Lance Corporal, who was killed aged just 38 towards the end of the Battle of the Somme, to connect him with the chap who played football and was such a massive part in that very early football celebrity. Say football's first real celebrity. So there's a little story to whet your appetite for that book.
No, I absolutely love that, and I'm thinking about getting that book because just doing similar reading to you, Martin. I mean, some of the lines are brilliant. I mean, the author of that book, he says basically, imagine Paul Gascoigne with a university education, and all that sort of stuff. And there's he was part of the Posh and Becks of its time with music hall star Marie Lloyd and all that sort of stuff. And there's the pictures that you see of him. He looks, as you described him, he looks like that sort of fella. But the impact he had on football, because of his character, they changed the rules, basically. And it's these characters in these sort of eras that change things, doesn't it, and shape things to come.
And I think it's a funny one because now I'm not sure why it would be, but I think his story isn't known as much as it probably should and could be. I think the vast majority of people probably haven't heard that much about him. But when you dig into it, he is an unbelievable character. As you say, Chris, both from a football and playing perspective and his personality. He changed a number of things in football in a very short space of time. So, yeah, sadly passed away aged just 38.
Loved that, Martin. It was fascinating. As you were speaking, though, I've just dug something out to double check I remembered this right. Just to prove what a fascinating character he was. He was hugely popular amongst the Sunderland fans, despite previously having to be smuggled away from the ground because he overheard a Sunderland fan whilst playing for the opposition criticising his teammates. And he thought, well, I'm not having this. So he apparently turned round and sparked the fan out just with one punch. So, yeah, just a really interesting, fascinating character. And, yeah, to be a much-loved Sunderland player, having previously picked a fight with a fan, takes some doing to turn around opinions there. That says a lot about what type of personality he was.
Yeah, and the other thing as well, just reading there, he was in goal when we beat Newcastle 9-1 at St James's Park in 1908. And I'm not sure what the story is, but apparently there's a story behind him keeping the match ball. Don't know whether you know that one, Martin, or not.
No, it doesn't.
The author. Well, I suppose I'll have to read the book to find out, because apparently the author said not only was he in goal, but he got to keep the match ball as well, and he said that's a whole other story in itself, which is a good teaser.
I'll have to dig the book out and tell you next week, won't I?
Well, lads, are you going to say no to him? He's already apparently wiped out one Sunderland fan for saying something out of turn. So if he says he wants to take the match ball home for his music hall better half or whatever, you're going to let him do it, aren't you? Oh yes, you take what you want.
Yeah. But on the financial side, potentially he turned football that little bit more professional, or that he made it ridiculous, the fact that the players couldn't be paid maybe what they were worth or what other people were willing to pay them.
Well, it was a funny thing, wasn't it? Because you go fast forward a few years from there, and you couldn't play football professionally if you were an amateur. So you had all of these really good football players who stayed as amateur because they could earn more money playing for Bishop Auckland or whoever on a Saturday, and then go into the job during the week. And I think it was only until they actually abolished the minimum wage and all that sort of stuff that kind of really leveled out that playing field. But for an awful long time, amateur football was exceptionally good, wasn't it?
Yeah. And it was just to sad end, and again with the way the author puts it, it's talking at 1:45 p.m. on Saturday, the 7th of October 1916. Basically, he climbed from a Allied trench near a French village, and him alongside 200 of the 9th Royal Fusiliers, as he said, were never seen again. It's just when we talk about that war and all that and how ridiculous it was, but it's just sad when you read it on paper like that.
Certainly is, but yes, I can heartily recommend that book. It's been a few years since I've read it. I might have to have a reread of it again. I think it's currently sat on my father-in-law's bookshelf, so I will get that back off him next time I go to their house.
But if anyone knows a story about the match ball, get in touch.
Indeed. We will go on to the 8th of October now. 1912, Sunderland signed right back Charlie Gladwin from Blackpool for £1,000. And Sunderland won 26 out of the 36 games he played during the remainder of that season to claim the top flight championship and also the runners-up spot in the FA Cup. 1960, Willie McFeet made his debut against Leeds United, and 6 years later, in 1966, Nick Sharkey made his final appearance for Sunderland. It was his 99th league start as we drew 2-2 at home to West Brom. 1972, Stan Varga was born. Stan Varga, who we've talked about a couple of times on various podcasts recently, but 1972 was the birth date of Stan. 1994, we've talked about Martin Smith briefly today as well, and the goal from Martin Smith, and 2 from somebody else that we've talked about today, Phil Gray, gave Sunderland a 3-1 win at West Bromwich Albion. On the 8th of October in 2013, Gus Poyet was appointed as Sunderland manager. I think it was the last week we talked a little bit about Kevin Ball's caretaker spell in charge prior to Poyet being appointed, and there was a few names going around. I think was it Roberto Di Matteo was one who was named as a favourite early on in that race, but Gus Poyet came out ahead and he was appointed as Sunderland manager. Obviously, didn't go with the best of starts with that game against Swansea at the Liberty Stadium, but everything came all right in the following game, as it tended to do for Sunderland managers around that point. And 2019 was the last day that Jack Ross was employed by the club. He was sacked after an indifferent start, I think, to his second season. It wasn't terribly bad, but it was a little bit indifferent, and I think Sunderland had banked everything on going up that season and wanted to give us the best possible chance of doing so. So they appointed Phil Parkinson. We'll move on to October the 9th. 1880, the club. And now we're not going to get into this debate of 1879 or 1880, but October the 9th, 1880 is, by some records, when the club held its first practice game. October the 9th, 1943, as we've talked about already, Jim Montgomery. He was born in Hendon in 1943. 1954, Roker Park saw its second largest ever league crowd, more than 66,000, officially anyway, packed into the stadium to see us beat the Mags 4-2. Goals from Ted Purden, 2 from Billy Bingham and 1 from Ken Chisholm gave us the win. Newcastle had Bob Stoker in their team. Ivor Broadus, who I think we talked about last week, has been the manager who sold himself to Sunderland when he was at Carlisle. And another ex-Sunderland player, and I always like to just drop this in just for fun, Jackie Milburn was also in Newcastle's team. October 9th, 1990. This was this game at Bristol City, where we beat Bristol City 6-1 in the League Cup. Thomas Hauser scored after about 20 seconds or something like that, but he got stretched off injured. And he'd done his cruciate or his Achilles. Maybe his Achilles. I think he's done his Achilles, but he didn't reappear until later on that season when relegation was almost confirmed. And there was a story going around because when he made his comeback game that season, Dennis Smith called him up for a game away at Southampton down at the Dell. And he hadn't even been on the bench since he came back from injury. So Dennis Smith chucked him back in. I think it was a bit of a last throw of the dice. And he scored. And at that point, he was widely regarded as being the first German ever to score in top flight of English football. When you dig into it, there was a fella who played for Spurs, I think maybe in 1910s, who is potentially the first German to score. But if Thomas isn't the first, he was certainly the second. So
was he not potentially the first East German or something like that?
Well, West German, wasn't he, Thomas Hauser? So he was...
I was clutching at straws.
The other fellow might have been from East Germany. There you go, because back in the day with the Berlin Wall, there were 2 separate countries, technically. 1993, we talked about the Leeds United game, where we beat Leeds 2-1 at Elland Road. Now, on the Saturday, Lee Howie started up front, and he scored as we beat Birmingham. Now, I did wonder whether somebody had picked up an injury in that Leeds game or somebody had got arrested. And I suspect this was Lee Howie's first goal for us. I think it was a really nice goal from the edge of the box. He curled it in with his left foot, which was a bit of an unusual goal for Lee Howie to score. But he was more than capable of doing so.
Incidentally, that was the John Kay rolling himself off the pitch.
Yeah, right. Yes,
and that was the last we saw of John Kay in a Sunderland strip.
It was I
think we talked about John Kay last week. I think, didn't we?
It was a sad but also fitting way for John Kay, who tried to brush off a broken leg and row himself off the field.
If I remember rightly, and I might have this, it was actually John Kay who set Lee Howie up for the goal.
Yeah, okay.
I think he set him up for the goal. Then 15 minutes later, just before half time, got crocked. But it was John Kay throwing himself in. It wasn't. I don't think it was the worst tackle in the world on John Kay. I think it was just full blooded by 2 players, and it happens.
I seem to think, just to tie up with something somebody we mentioned earlier, I think John Kay, although he'd played his last first team game for us, did have a couple of attempts at getting back. He was at the club for a while. I don't think he was released until that time Peter Reid came in And I think Anthony Smith, who we were talking about earlier, I seem to think both he and John Kay were both allowed to go. They were both released at the same time, and two fullbacks whose time at Sunderland had to end on sad circumstances due to injury.
Was Gary Bennett released at the same time? Because Bennett and
think,
John Kay went to Scarborough together, didn't they?
yes, I think Reid, he came in, he had like that initial little bunch of games where he kept us up. And I think Bennett did play under Reid, but then in the summer he did let a few stalwarts, Tony Norman as well, perhaps. Yeah. So he lost quite a bit of experience in that period.
He did. 1994, on October the 9th, Rach Carter passed away, aged 80-year-old. Another good talent from Sunderland, as we talk about Monty and people being produced from the area. Another great talent. And I remember with Rach Carter, my first year at I was at university in Leeds. I was talking to this lad who was a Hull fan. He's talking about football as you do. He goes, "Oh, my granddad used to play for Sunderland." So you go, "Oh, aye." And he goes, "Called Carter." And my mind immediately went, "Tim Carter? He can't be that old." He goes, "No, Rach." I was like, "Oh." So yeah, me and Pete became best friends after that. I took him up to the stadium a couple of times to have a look at the Rach Carter bar and other sort of stuff. But that was quite a nice little connection there.
That Tim Carter Centre in Hendon, that's a brilliant sports centre, that mind. I used to play a lot of five-a-side football there back in the day.
Yeah, it's funny how your mind works sometimes, isn't it? 2015, October the 9th, and if you look at October the 8th, 2013, Gus Poyet was appointed. October the 9th, 2015, Big Sam was appointed. Loses his first away game and then beat Newcastle at home in the second game. Something like that. It tended to go like that at that time. We will take another short ad break and we'll be back with you very soon.
As a contractor, I don't pay for materials I don't use. So why would I pay for stuff I don't need in my mobile plan? That's why the new MyBiz plan from Verizon Business is so perfect. Now I can choose exactly what I want, and I only pay for what I need.
Right now, with MyBiz plan, get our best price, as low as $25 a line. Visit Verizon.com/business to get started today. New lines only. Price per month with 5+ lines. Includes auto pay and paper-free billing and promotional discount. Taxes, fees, economic adjustment charge. Applicable add-ons, prices, and terms apply. Guarantee applies to base monthly rate and stated discounts only. Add-on prices additional. Offers end September 30th, 2025.
At Starbucks, we've more than doubled parental leave for full and part-time baristas, giving them up to 18 weeks of paid time off, so they can be there for early bedtimes, late nights, first laughs, and spend more time with the best company they know. At Starbucks, benefits like parental leave are just the start. Learn more about Starbucks industry-leading benefits at starbucks.com/partners.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to help you make the most of your summer with Michelob Ultra, a superior light beer worth playing for. Play for it with the guys when you're competing to see who can sink more birdies on the golf course, because winning tastes even better with Ultra on the line. Play for Ultra. Fill your fridge with Michelob Ultra this summer. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2025 Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
Welcome back to How the podcast for another episode of On This Week, and we are recommencing on October the 10th. 1925, Sunderland beat Everton 7-3 in a game at Roker Park with goals from, you guessed it, Dave Halliday, who got 2, and another 2 for Bobby Marshall. 1981, Barry Venison made his debut in a game away at Notts County. Sunderland got beat 2-0, but Barry Venison went on to have a good career at Sunderland, of course, captaining the side at Wembley in 85. But I'll never forgive him for waving at the crowd and all that sort of stuff just before the 92 FA Cup final, when he was still a Liverpool player, only to sign for Newcastle the following week. 1987. Now, this is officially the birth date of the proper G-Force, Chris. The proper G-Force. Not your pretendy one from 1993. It's the proper G-Force.
Yeah, no, that's it. And, it's funny how things turn out, isn't it? We talked about, I think we mentioned the other week, the injury to Keith Birchin, who Dennis Smith had put hung his hat on for this season to kind of play up front. And it was, what was it? off the top of my head, it was going to be Birchin and Swindlehurst. I want to say the two started that season. But yeah,
I think Swindlehurst had gone by that point, hadn't he?
Who was the other one then? There was Birchin and someone else up front.
I think Gates and Birchin started the season up front.
Yeah, because I thought Gates was out of the picture a little bit, but looking at the Brentford game, yeah, it was Gates and Birchin up front. But Gates had seemingly kind of gone out of favour a little bit, if I remember rightly.
Well, he was on the transfer list, I think, wasn't he?
Yeah,
being asked to leave.
Yeah, but there was so Birchin had gotten injured, and it was actually, I think it was an elbow that got Birchin, wasn't it? And it was kind of a facial injury because he had to go to a specialist, and they kind of ruled him out, and he didn't come back till early November. Because in the meantime, we obviously brought in Marco Gabardini for 80,000, and he'd actually played at Roker against McMenemy's side. He came on as a sub in the League Cup. I think we talked about this the other week. And it's funny because I think, I can't remember who talked about it, whether it was Eric Gates or Dennis Smith, but essentially the conversation went, I think Eric Gates had seen him, Marco Gabardini, play in training, this new 19-year-old striker who came in and basically just had an eye for goal and wanted to run in behind. And I think after Birchin got injured, Dennis Smith just turned around to him, and I think the conversation was essentially, what can you do with playing in front of Marco? And Eric Gates' reply was simply, get the ball into my feet and I'll get him in. Don't worry about that. And basically Eric Gates just took lumps out of his calves, centre-halves kicking the lumps out of him as he got the ball to feet, turned around and just knocked Marco in over the top or through on and goal. And basically that's how it worked for about 3 years. But like you say, this was the first real game, because the Chester game, Marco Gabardini made his debut up front with Birchin when Birchin got injured. But he got injured against Fulham. And then in this Wigan game, they both got 2 each. Paul Jewell actually got Wigan's goal, incidentally. But yeah, this was kind of the birthday, really, if you like, Martin, like you said, of the original G-Force, Gates and Gabardini, because it's amazing to think that this strike force took us from this position in Division 3. And actually, a few weeks earlier, for that Chester game that we mentioned, Marco's debut, we got beat 2-0. And I think we hadn't won for 5 straight games in Division 3, and we were 12th in the table. And then you're talking a couple of weeks later, we're hammering Wigan 4-1, 2 strikers getting 2 each, and we go top of the table, and that was pretty much it for the rest of the season. Stayed pretty much top of the table, bar once. I think it was maybe once or twice or something like that for a couple of weeks. But yeah, for 3 seasons, they kind of bounced us up to the top division. And then I always feel it was a sad end, that Gates kind of came off at Wembley, and that was kind of the last time we saw him. And Dennis Smith said since, if he could have kept Gates and McPhail, he thinks Spurs had a chance of staying up that season. But yeah, you would have liked to have seen them kind of finish it off in the top division and Gates to return there. But who knows? Gates might have been out of his depth. You just never know. But
I think he probably still would have had something to offer, I suspect, if he kept him on.
Yeah, but the thing is, whenever you watch highlights, especially there's that brilliant reel of the promotion season 89-90, and when you watch Gates and Gabardini, I think the lads were talking about it the other day. By the way, there was the Q&A. I think you were on it, by the way, Andrew. Gav started saying how much better it is now, much more fun. I thought he was talking complete crap, by the way. If you watch Gates and Gabardini, 2 up front are working like that, I mean, it's much more fun than this 1 up front nonsense that you see now. That was much more fun to have 2 strikers like that, because you watch that highlight reel of that season, it just looks so easy.
Well, it was for them, wasn't it? They had almost a telepathic understanding. I tell you what's interesting when you look back on this Wigan game, because we've talked a lot about that big man in Birch and getting injured and all that sort of stuff. In the Fulham game, in the midweek, Gates wasn't on the bench, and when Birch got injured, John Moore came on, who was a young centre forward. He came on, played the first half, outplayed the second half. Mark Wood scored 2, win 2-0. And you kind of think Dennis Smith would have kept him in the side given that he'd done relatively well at Craven Cottage and partnered Mark, but he'd obviously seen something with Eric Gates and the potential to link up with Gabbiadini. And yeah, Gatesy got 2 goals in the first 20 minutes of that game against Wigan, and Marco got another couple, and that was it. They're off and running.
Yeah, but like you say with that John Moore one, the conversation must have happened because Eric Gates comes straight in, partners him for the Aldershot game, which is the game before the Wigan game, and Gabbiadini scores twice. Then we win 3-1.
Oh, so
you imagine,
right, yeah.
you imagine Gates got the assists for those. You can't imagine, or either Marco did one of those. I'll run from the halfway line because I can. But yeah, you see the simplicity of the ball being played in Eric Gates. Eric Gates turning a defender, just looking where Marco is, just playing him in, and Marco goes through and scores. For 3 years, that worked for us, and it was almost that thing where and I've said this before. There used to be a lad at school, and he'll know who he is if he listens. But he did the same trick every time, and you know what? You knew what he was going to do, and you still couldn't get the ball off him. And it was like this with Gates and Gabbiadini. That teams would have watched us, went right. It's going to go into Gates' feet, and then he's going to knock it over the top of Marco, and they still couldn't do anything about it.
I had a friend like that, Macca one move, we called him. But Macca, if you're listening, Macca, it was a great move, mate.
It's better than being Andrew no moves, So he had one move more than me.
Are we talking about the dance floor now, Andrew, or is it still on footy?
Oh, I've got God knows how many dance floor moves. You don't want to know.
Well, there's the next international fancy I saw. Let's get Andrew on the dance floor.
Well, Kelvin can sing the music, and I'll dance along to it. There you go.
That'd be worth paying for. Right. We will continue on October the 10th, 1999. England played Belgium at the Stadium of Light, and Kevin Phillips played up front in that game, becoming obviously the first Sunderland player to play for England at the Stadium of Light. 2002, now, this was the day that Howard Wilkinson and Steve Cotterill were officially appointed as Sunderland manager and assistant manager. And Cotterill often gets lost in the whole conversation about Howard Wilkinson. But at the time, this was kind of touted as real forward thinking and succession planning by Bob Murray, wasn't it? Cotterill was manager of Stoke. I think he'd only recently gone to Stoke, maybe even that summer. After where was he? Was he at Chelmsford before that as manager? He was
it Cheltenham?
Cheltenham, sorry.
Yeah.
Cheltenham. Yeah, he was manager at Cheltenham, and then he got appointed as Stoke manager that summer. And then you're talking only a couple of months later, he gives up the job at Stoke, who were in the second tier in the Championship, to come and be Howard Wilkinson's assistant at Sunderland. The Stoke fans hated him for an awful long time for doing that. And you can kind of understand why, because I think he'd started off very well with them. But I always kind of think he gets a little bit lost in the whole Wilkinson conversation, because it was actually quite a big... It seemed like we were appointing 2 managers. In fact, the way it was sold was that Cotterill was actually going to be the manager, and Wilkinson was kind of overseeing everything and almost providing a bit of an older head to guide him. But I don't know whether results kind of dictated that Howard Wilkinson had more of an input than he was initially intended to do or what, but it's safe to say it never worked out.
It's Cotterill ever since, I think his whole career has been impacted by that, because he was a bright young thing. This was seen as a really good move to bring him in and bed him in, and eventually he would take over. And then in more recent years, he just seems to be one of those names we used to always come up against in League One. Sadly, his career did tail off. I think he was very ill, wasn't he, at one point?
He was.
Perhaps. I think he's done well to get back, and I believe he's still in the game. So, that he's a battler if nothing else. But I think, there was expectations of him to become a really big star in coaching and in management.
Yeah, and that was the reason, because I think I've heard them talk since that they didn't actually know each other. They weren't pally, they weren't mates or anything like that. And Howard Wilkinson had been out of club football since 1996. So, best part of a decade, when he'd left Leeds, that was it. He went and worked for, I think it was FA technical director at the time. And he was 58 years old, which isn't, hugely old for a manager, but one who's been, you think about managers now who've been out of the game for a decade, and you'd be amazed if they got a job in the Premier League after 10 years, almost 10 years out of the job. And like you said, these two didn't know each other because he was FA technical director. He kind of knew the lay of the land in terms of who were the supposed big talents in coaching in the country. And he said to Bob Murray, right, I want him as my number 2. We want the manager of Stoke City, which makes, we're talking about Alex Neil going not that long ago, of course, and we nicked their manager to be our number 2. So maybe they can have that one. They can have Alex Neil. But it really was a strange one. But I think Martin touched on it there, that you read the press at the time, and there was this, I think if it was just Howard Wilkinson, people would have been going, oh, we're not quite sure about that. But with the Steve Cotterill appointment, they kind of started to make some sense, where you had this older head and this brilliant new coach coming through, young coaches underneath him. And I remember at the time there was a big thing about kind of football finances, and with the Bosman ruling coming in around that time. I think it was 2001, 2002. So it would have been around this time. I think it was that summer where the Bosman ruling came in, and that the emphasis was on making players better and rather than kind of buying your way out of it and buying players. And I was looking at the bookies' favourites at the time, and on the list was, of course, Mick McCarthy, who took over later in the season. David O'Leary was on the list. George Burley was on the list, and the last one was John Gregory, was also linked with the manager's job. But the strange thing about it was the story that I think we've all heard at some point, was that Bob Murray rang up Howard Wilkinson for advice, didn't he? And I mean, I don't know how somebody rings you up for a bit of advice and you end up getting a top job through it. I mean, it's never quite happened to me, but but yeah. And Bob Murray said since that, because we could talk about the Peter Reid one and get into that a little bit, but I've always said that, sacking a manager or making a change is never really the wrong decision. It's what you do next. And, if you do sack Peter Reid, we could have signed a fantastic manager who took us up the mid-table and kicked us on and all this sort of stuff. It's about the decision you make after. If you decide to make a change, it's all well and good. But the other very quick thing, just because we mentioned the Allardyce thing, I remember how the FA were with us then. And Bob Murray said, I should like to thank the FA for releasing Howard from the remainder of his contract, which was not due to expire until June 2004. The Wilkinson-Cotterill team was a key determinant in our decision to make this appointment. We believe this partnership will reap rewards as it brings a complementary blend of experience and achievement with technical expertise and new ideas. While they may be from different eras, both Howard and Steve have impressive CVs, outstanding technical skills, as well as the highest coaching qualifications in the game. But yeah, just after our relationship with the FA and the Allardyce thing, it was interesting that it might be because it's Howard Wilkinson at this point, but the FA just went, yeah, you can have him. How much do you want for him? Don't worry about that. We'll rip up his contract. It's fine.
Lads, Wilkinson's getting such a bad rap here. After what you said earlier, Chris, if it wasn't for that pesky back pass rule coming in, Wilkinson would have fired us to the top, surely. So bless him. He had one hand tied behind his back when he came back into management.
Do you think? Really? Ooh,
no, I'm joking. I'm joking.
I was going to say.
I'm joking when you're saying how badly Leeds collapsed after the back pass rule, and then about 10 years later, he's already been found out, hasn't he? After his success with Leeds, and perhaps his ideas were becoming outdated, and then 10 years or however many years it is down the line, we've suddenly brought him back from obscurity. And had he technically been in charge of England for a couple of games in between permanent managers?
Yeah, he has.
So he obviously had the gift of the gab, because he's managed to get himself a decent job at the FA. He's managed to talk himself into Bob Murray's thinking, but just
I think, to be fair to him at the time, he was very well respected as a certain type of sort of football administrator, wasn't he? He was kind of looked upon as he had a very sort of big reputation as a long ball merchant in the 80s, didn't he? With Sheffield Wednesday and with Leeds. But, his coaching ability kind of suggests with England and the FA technical director, it suggests that he was highly regarded in the corridors that mattered, I guess, if you put it that way.
From what I gather, though, it wasn't in all seriousness, it wasn't necessarily his training. It was more all of this like team bonding and all of these ideas about grasping the nettle and flying in
ducks fly and stuff like that.
Geese formation. But just for the record, I can categorically state I wasn't trying to defend Howard Wilkinson, or I do not envisage a world where Howard Wilkinson had Sunderland pushing at the top and him recreating his Leeds title-winning success.
I think Kelvin called the BBC to promote Wilkinson's virtues and stand up for him. So he'll.
I genuinely, I remember having a conversation with my brother at the time, just saying this might not be the stupidest idea in the world at the time. To be fair, I would have preferred one of the other ones. I was trying to put a positive slant on it when the appointment actually happened, because you did think, well, look. It's Howard Wilkinson. He's come from England, and we've got this young coach that we've getting from a management position. And you just thought, actually, could it work? But it seemed like from everything we've heard since that, Wilkinson had just lost touch with what footballers responded to. And there's that famous story, isn't there, when he announced to the players he was leaving. And there's a Tom Peters at the back just stood up and went, "Yes, get it." About the only thing he did at Sunderland, apparently.
That's right. I saw Tom Peters. Sorry, go on, Andrew.
No, I'm always here for Tom Peters chat, so I want to hear. I want to hear this story.
I remember seeing Tom Peters score for Sunderland in a game at Bellevue Ground, the old Bellevue Ground at Concert. Sunderland used to always play a pre-season friendly, and I saw Tom Peters score once. So you
got the T-shirt. I saw Tom Peters score for Sunderland.
Hung up with my John Stead one.
The point I was going to make was, Martin, I think you're true in what you say. Steve Cotterill now doesn't get spoken about as much, but it's quite rare for an assistant manager or whatever role he had to have got such press at the time. Normally a new manager is appointed, and then maybe a couple of days later there'll be a snippet at the end of an article. So-and-so was brought in, his right-hand man. But yeah, Cotterill very much was presented as part of this duo. He wasn't an afterthought. He was a major part of the thinking.
And, if you look at Cotterill at the time, right, he was 38 when he came to Sunderland. He'd only been finished playing for a few seasons. But he took Cheltenham up from the 6th tier to the 3rd division. So he got them promoted sort of 3 tiers. Interestingly, he started his managerial career at Sligo Rovers. Now, you can kind of do some dot joining here, as we like to do. So Cotterill played for Wimbledon in the late 80s, early 90s. He joined them the season after they won the FA Cup. Laurie Sanchez was there at Wimbledon. Now, Laurie Sanchez, after he packed in playing, went to Sligo Rovers, did really well, and got the Wickham job and then the Northern Ireland job. So you kind of imagine that he's put a word in for Cotterill at Sligo. Cotterill's done all right there. He's gotten Cheltenham, done really well. Got that move to Stoke, as we talked about. And when you look at his Stoke record, it wasn't as if he'd kind of won the first 10 games of the season or something. He'd won a few here, lost a couple, drawn a couple. He hadn't gone to all guns blazing in Stoke, but he was such a highly rated coach at the time that he obviously thought it was a really good thing to do. But as you rightly say, they were presented together at the press conference. They were sat side by side, and it was very much positioned as he's Howard Wilkinson, the old guy who's going to oversee everything. Cotterill's a young, as kind of sold as Cotterill would take over as manager in the sort of medium term. I always remember Cotterill was, he always loved to write things down. He was always stood outside the dugout, jotting things down in his notebook. And there was a story, which I don't know if it's true, and I really hope it is, but there was a game deep in the struggles that happened later on that season. Cotterill stood there jotting things down. he pauses for a moment and he kind of ponders, looks around, and somebody says, "What's the matter, Cotterill? Can't you smell shite?" Which kind of summed up Steve Cotterill's tenure at Sunderland. He had quite a, he's still manager. He's actually gone back to Cheltenham Town this season, so he's gone back full circle. But after leaving Sunderland, he actually had a year out of the game and then went to Burnley. He was Burnley manager for 3 years. Actually, he was Burnley manager when Carlos Edwards scored that goal that got us promoted that night.
Yeah,
I think he's Burnley manager.
Yeah, there's a bit in Roy Keane's book, isn't there? When we played Burnley at their place, and he said you go in behind the scenes afterwards. He said you go to the manager's office of the opposition. He said you have these, sandwiches and tea, and it's all a bit awkward. And he said you're not trying to give anything away, and he said it's just a thing that you do, and he said it's not particularly pleasant. But he said the one place he said he quite enjoyed it was I think we got away with it at Burnley, if I remember rightly. We were lucky at Burnley.
Conley and Ledbetter scored really late.
Yeah, but Burnley had battered us. And he said he walked into the office after the game, and Steve Cotterill was there and just was like, "You lucky bastard!" Basically, just banging on the table, going, "I don't believe how did you get away with that?" But Roy Keane thought that's brilliant. He went, "I'd rather that and have a proper conversation than it just all be a bit awkward."
No, he had 3 years at Burnley as manager. Then he was out the game for 3 years. He had a little spell at Notts County, a season at Portsmouth, a season at Forest, 3 years at Bristol City, a season at Birmingham, 3 years at Shrewsbury Town, which coincided with us coming across them in League One, a year at Forest Green, where he turned vegetarian, and back at Cheltenham. So he's had a bit of a journeyman managerial career, but yeah, it could have all been so different if he'd just been given the job himself. It probably would have turned out better than it did for him, but we will never know.
Well, I'm just very quickly, gents, because this was the appointment, but what's your take on the sacking of Peter Reid? Because I do think he was at the end of his time, and I think it was maybe in the summer when if he'd walked away, he would have walked away a hero, because we'd finished fourth bottom the season before. But, whoever was going to follow Peter Reid had a job on his hands, because he was just so popular, regardless how well we were doing with the majority of the players. But, was it the timing they got wrong, or the sacking in the first place? I mean, what do you think about the sacking in the first place?
It was completely the wrong time to sack him. I would say to start with, and I think it's really easy now, isn't it, to look back on Peter Reid's 7 years at the club as all being sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, and it wasn't. We had the initial impact and him getting us promoted, and then going back down and going back up again eventually, and then it was 2 7th place finishes. The season or two after that, it kind of got a bit tired, and some of his signings weren't great. He wasted quite a lot of money on a few players who never actually made an impact at first team level. And there was numerous points during that period where he could have been sacked, but we kind of stuck with him. The feeling around the club at the time, I think actually if you took a straw poll of people at the time of the sacking, I'm not sure how many would have completely disagreed with it. People would disagree with the timing of it, like I do and did at the time. But if you remember, it had the was it like the ALS had done like the read in or read out T-shirts or fanzine covers or something, hadn't there? So there was this big ongoing debate about whether Peter Reid should stay, was the right man to take us on. He, in that summer, he probably should have left. And I think if he'd left of his own accord at the end of that season, it would have been a good thing. It would have given us time to find an adequate replacement. But he's not the sort of manager, I think, to walk away. And I think if you look back at some of the, he was linked with the England job, and this is how highly he was regarded at the time. He was linked with the England job. Blackburn, who were challenging up the top of the table at that point in the Premier League, they wanted him at one point. He turned them down. Everton, he was continually linked with, and I think he'd been offered the job at Everton, and he turned it down. So there was all of this going on. But I think I don't know what you think, Andrew. I think there was points where you would have understood it, or I would have understood it more than the point it actually happened. You look at we talked about the results. We beat Aston Villa 1-0 at home, beat Cambridge away 7-0, and then got beat 3-1 Arsenal. And look, getting beat 3-1 Arsenal isn't the worst thing in the world. The performance wasn't fantastic. I think it was a bit lackluster and insipid, but you're playing Arsenal away. You could have stuck with them. I think we would have been an awful lot better off that season if we had.
I think the word you used, Martin, that feels right for me is it had got a bit tired under Reid, and I, at the time, thought it was right for him to go. I've now revised that decision. Like as Chris says, the decision to get rid of a manager is kind of twofold, because it's not just whether you get rid of the manager, it's who you bring him in to replace him with. Reid could be so stubborn with things. If a player, it doesn't matter how good a player was, if you fell out with Reid, that was it. You're done. He seemed stubborn about spending money. I remember the fans used to chant about, "Hey, Reedy, where's the money gone?" Because he would, in some respects, not want to spend money, but then in other respects, when he did spend money, that gift he had, that golden touch of discovering players, had deserted him. Was that the summer where he got a drink thrown on him at a pre-season game, or was that the year?
That might have been the year before.
Right. I certainly remember, and of course I am not condoning that. That's a ridiculous thing to do to any human being. But I think the fans had turned against him. As I say, there was chants about him. There was this, just, I think everybody had kind of, the magic had gone. The magic had gone. I wasn't surprised when he was asked to leave. He could have perhaps left earlier and gone with his head held high, but that's not his style. Also, as well, Reid for a long time had a lot of shares in the club. He was an influential figure. He wasn't just going to walk away for the sake of it. And yes, he might have had attractive jobs elsewhere, but did they offer him the same package? I mean, he was in full control at Sunderland. What he said went. If he wanted a player, they were bought, whether Bob Murray knew about it beforehand or not. He had a very certain way of doing things. You used to hear contract negotiations were just written down on like a serviette and handed over to the player and all this type of thing. He had a way of doing things, and he certainly ruled the roost at the club. But yeah, things had run their course. He could have maybe gone a little bit earlier. I thought at the time when he went, it was right, but it's since proved that he would have surely done a better job than Wilkinson and Cotterill.
I think that incident that you talked about actually was that pre-season, Andrew, looking at the pre-season fixtures. I remember it was away in Spain, I think, wasn't it?
Once you've lost the fans, though, it's pretty much game over. It's very rare. Not everybody was against him, but there was certainly a percentage of fans that had their fill of him. And when that happens, it's not long before the relationship ends.
Well, it was often you talk about the stubbornness that he had, but with certain players being fixtures in the side. I remember Kevin Kilban having an awful run of form, and Reid would just stick with him and stick with him and stick with him. And there was other players like that. And you kind of look at what he did in transfer market earlier on with Sunderland. And then the last sort of 18 months, he seemed to bring in just old pros. It was almost like the McMenemy book of signings. You're bringing in people like Phil Babb, Jason McAteer, people like that. And you're filling up the squad with that type of player who are certainly on the way down, but not on the way up. And the other thing I would also throw in the mix, now this isn't related to Peter Reid, but I think it contributed to his, not to his downfall, but to what happened with Sunderland as a team over the last couple of seasons. And we talked about Kevin Phillips playing for England at the Stadium of Light a moment ago. And I will remain convinced till my dying day that Kevin Phillips completely changed his playing style because he wasn't getting a look in for England. he was playing on Niall Quinn's shoulder, playing the last man, scoring 30 goals in the Premier League, winning the European Golden Boot, did not get a look in properly for England. So he was going away on international duty, going, well, how am I going to get in? If goal scoring is not going to get me into this team, how am I going to get in? And he, over that period of time, you saw him dropping deeper and deeper and deeper, trying to link up play, trying to be a better footballer, in inverted commas. And it was actually to the detriment of him and to the team. Now, he became a far better footballer in those later years than he potentially was in his first 4 or 5 seasons, or 3 or 4 seasons in Sunderland. But he wasn't as good a goal scorer. And I think that also played a part in the sort of the whole story.
I don't disagree with what you've just said, Martin, but what I will say slightly in his defence of making that change is that the downfall of Niall Quinn was a factor in him forcing him to change his game, because he couldn't play off the last man behind, waiting for Quinn's flick-ons. And the other thing is, because the downfall of Niall Quinn, if you look at the players that Peter Reid signed, you could point to the likes of Jason McAteer being a replacement for Don Hutchison, and you said Kevin Kilban wasn't quite that solution on the left, and Julio Arca moved back a little bit when kind of Mickey Gray was injured for periods, and we didn't have that. We didn't have people going to wingers crossing the ball in like we used to, or cutting inside from the right, and so he changed his game because Peter Reid changed the way Sunderland played. And I don't think Peter Reid wanted to change the way he played. I just think he bought the wrong players and it didn't work.
Quite possibly, but my story enables me to blame Kevin Keegan. So,
oh well, if you'd said that to start with, I wouldn't have done another argument against it.
Jason McAteer is a one-off. I don't necessarily think of as being a particularly bad signing. It was more these randoms he brought in from here, there, and everywhere that you'd never heard of. Like Tom Peters. Tom Peters was brought in, and Bernd Haas, who we spoke about last week. It was more those players that kind of, I think they had an impact on the changing room as well. Reid had always been big on cultivating a strong team spirit, and some of these new lads didn't fit in with that culture, maybe.
Well, he had loads, and he had even going back to the early, this wasn't something new, for signing Carson Fredgard and people like that. Lillian
Eriksson.
Lillian Lasland, he came in, didn't do a great deal, and you had obviously Milton Nunes and people like that. Nicholas Medina, we spent an awful lot of money on, and I think it was Wilkinson who gave him his debut eventually, because he hadn't had a look in.
Thomas Helmer disappeared.
Yeah. I think this is where one of the this question about where's the money gone, that was one of the questions, because he did spend money. It was whether he spent it correctly.
Well, the other thing, Martin, you mentioned, and you're right, and if you look at the signings of Tor Andre Flo, because I remember Bob Murray talking about conversations he had with his Rangers counterpart, where he was like, you didn't tell us he was finished, basically. Yeah. You took the 9 million or whatever it was. But the other thing was, he did buy the likes of David Bellion and Matt Piper, who were real kind of young prospects who we thought were going to come good. And so he was trying to do that side as well, because Matt Piper was brilliant for Leicester. I thought he was a great signing when we got him for, what was it, 3.5 million plus some add-ons, I think it was. I thought he was a great signing. I couldn't believe we're getting him, actually, because I thought, loads of teams would have been in for him at Leicester. And I thought he might have been one of that solution, because Matt Piper and Julio Arca on your wings, and you think, oh, actually, we've got half a chance here. But I just think, for me, it was Peter Reid, and I've said this a few times, I don't think Peter Reid prepared well enough for losing Niall Quinn. And I think if he had the chance at one point to go out and buy Peter Crouch before I think he went to Villa, and I think that if he'd made that purchase at that point, I think we might have been able to kick on a little bit. And Phillips wouldn't have, been done by the curse of Keegan, of course.
Soon as we're talking about Kevin Phillips there, I've just been running this through my head and saying, do I want to say this out loud? Kevin Phillips is a sacred... Your faces are looking worried here. Kevin Phillips is almost like the sacred cow. I'm just going to say it. I never had the same affection for him as somebody like Niall Quinn or Kevin Ball, for example. Am I fair in saying that while some players come to Sunderland and end up loving the club, is it fair to say that Kevin Phillips was professional, but Kevin Phillips wasn't in love with Sunderland quite in the same way? He appreciated the support he got, but there's discussions there about did he change his game to help his England chances? Certainly under Wilkinson, I don't think he covered himself in any glory for the team. I think he played for himself rather than the team. Is Kevin Phillips the same kind of club legend as somebody like Niall Quinn, who had a passion for Sunderland AFC? Or is that me just barking up the wrong tree?
But Niall Quinn, you can't compare you can't really compare many players to someone who was a player, coach, manager, chairman, and came back to save the club and goalkeeper.
Yeah.
But came back to save the club when it might have gone bust and stuff like that. It's a big call to compare him to someone like that. But I know what you mean. Yeah, I was going to say Kevin Ball is the. But but it's like you can't expect everyone to be that sort of character, heart on sleeve, can you? But I know what you mean. That you might be naturally more attracted to those characters because that gets you up for the game, and that kind of pumps you up a little bit when things are going wrong. Maybe you look to those characters. But no, I mean, look, he probably had chances to leave and didn't. There was the Spurs.
Well, he did.
Wasn't it?
He did. He had a few chances to go elsewhere and force a move, didn't he? He didn't, and he probably should have. In hindsight.
And actually, if he was really looking after himself rather than changing his game, he would have moved clubs if he wasn't kind of in on it. And you saw what he was like. I remember him walking around with his boots in his hand. I think it was after the Arsenal game that season at the end, the last home game. And I remember him walking around, and you just knew he'd gone. And he looked absolutely gutted, and with the way it ended. But no, I think, yeah, I don't know. I know what you mean. Maybe it's just a character thing, I would say.
Yeah, personal taste. Maybe I'm just more. I have a soft spot more for the players who end up living in Sunderland later in their lives and what have you.
And both Quinny and Kevin Ball came back and worked for the club off the field. Didn't they? And Kevin Phillips left, and he played for other clubs for 10 years, 12 years after he left.
It was
if he'd come back under Quinny just before Roy Keane took over, and he'd fired us for promotion, he'd probably have a different.
It was a magic time. He was a brilliant player for us. I'm not having a pop at him as a person.
I understand completely what you're saying.
Yeah,
I completely understand it. I kind of agree with you to a large extent. But I think it is that different types of characters, and only he'd be able to tell us whether he was really kind of in it or not. But I guess the fact that he's been back up here as Shields manager and he's doing bits for the club. He was over in America last week for the club to do something or other, wasn't he? So he's doing bits.
I'd maybe put him in that same bracket as Marco Gabardini, where Gabardini was a hero, scored all these goals, but was never kind of pounding his chest and getting everybody else up for it. He was very professional and had he just wanted to score goals, and that's what he was about.
Maybe it was an age thing because, as you know, I adore Marco Gabardini even now. Maybe if I was a kid when Kevin Phillips was at his pomp, I might see him differently. And I will admit, this whole thing might purely because I was in a nightclub once. Absolutely.
Oh, here we go. Here's the story.
Off me face, and there's me.
Andrew, no moves. Did Kevin Phillips have more moves than you?
Yeah, that's what it was. No, I remember me bowling up to Kevin Phillips and trying to have a bit crack on with him, and he quite rightly wanted to have nothing to do with us and just give us basically the cold shoulder. Yes, nice to meet a fan. Turned his back on us. So maybe that subconsciously is what's caused all of this. But no, hey, just like I'm not saying Howard Wilkinson would have won us a title. I'm not dissing Kevin Phillips. Just with us talking about him, I was interested to know, was this kind of slight reservation around him, was that fair, or was that me just going in a sulk because he didn't want to chat to us in whichever club it was? It was probably Privilege back then or somewhere like that back in the day.
Oh, look, I think there's a load of players that season under Wilkinson did not do themselves any favours. I think you could apply the same feeling to people like Gavin McCann, Thomas Sorensen, even people like that who left, who wanted to leave and jump ship as soon as we were relegated. And I think we had to sell them for financial reasons anyway, but they were certainly quite keen to jump. And the fact that what did we get? 3.5 million from Southampton for Phillips after we could have got 15 million a few years earlier.
Didn't we cover that? Like most of that, we didn't actually get all of that fee.
No, we didn't get much of it at all.
Yeah.
I tell you
Anyway.
what, lads, your faces when I was starting to bring that topic of conversation up, you two were panicking, thinking, "Where's this going to go?" So at least I might get some stick for my Phillips agenda, but not quite as bad as you two were suspecting it was going to be.
If you'd started with a nightclub story, would have understood.
Right, given that we've established Andrew hates Kevin Phillips, we're going to move on to October the 11th and 1882. Now, this is an interesting chap. A fella called Arthur Bridget, who played for us, was born in 1882, but he refused to play on what they call religious days, so Sundays and stuff like that, because he was a member of the Brotherhood movement. So
he wasn't much fun in a nightclub either. When I spoke to him, he didn't want to know either.
You should have tried him on Tuesday. You might have got something out of him. 1975, Tony Towers got a penalty and Billy Hughes and Pop Robson got goals as we won 3-1 at home against Orient. Not Leyton Orient, they were just Orient at the time, which kept us at the top of Division 2. 1980 is a big momentous day. Nyron Nosworthy was born in Brixton on the 11th of October 1980. And on that very day, we were beating Crystal Palace 1-0 at Roker Park. Gary Rowell got the goal. Now, Tyne Tees related nightmares. 1992. Sunderland, who were playing in the FA Cup final just months before, beating Chelsea and beating Norwich and all that sort of stuff, travel to West Ham United, who we had played in that FA Cup run, home and away, beat them 3-2 at Upton Park. So we travel down to Upton Park. Tyne Tees have put this on TV because they think it's going to be a rerun of the spectacular away win that we had in the FA Cup, and it was anything but.
Yeah, because I guess this would have been on Central or Thames T or what was it? I can't remember. There used to be
Roger Thames TV.
Because London, they used to do all of the London Football League games. I can't remember what the
London Weekend Television, wasn't it?
That was it. So Tyne Tees, I guess, would have done it on the cheap because they would have sorted out all the cameras and stuff. So they basically just sent down a couple of commentators and all the cameras were set up. But yeah, this was a good few years where, and anyone of a certain age will remember that the Tyne Tees, the match, and that we just got stuffed every time we played. And funny enough, because I think the first time I saw us live on the television, and you might go further back because you're a bit older. I'll just throw that elbow out there. But the first time I saw us on the television against Arsenal at Roker Park in 1990-91. And it was towards the end of that season, and it was a 0-0 draw, and it was the worst game that you've ever seen in your entire life. Typical Roker Park. It was
Gary Howard nearly scored.
Yeah, I think that was the only shot in the whole game. I think David Seaman pulled off a cork. Didn't he pull it out of the corner, top corner or something like that? But it was the worst game you've ever seen in your life. The players couldn't control the ball because it was so windy. I remember there was an image of Brian Moore and Jimmy Greaves up on in the crow's nest on top of the clock stand, and they basically had about 5 blankets over them huddling together for warmth because they were just freezing cold, and the game didn't make things much better. But yeah, when we got relegated, when we started playing on Tyne Tees, and it was just awful. I mean, again, but in that cup run, we were on Sky against Chelsea. I remember for that second leg, and obviously that was a huge win at Roker Park, last one in the FA Cup, last minute, basically Gordon Armstrong's header. But yeah, Tyne Tees, I don't know what it was. The music, it still gives me nightmares. I remember used to play Sunday League football and then come home and watch the match. And when we were on there, you just knew we were going to get beat. You've already mentioned that game against Middlesbrough. And I remember that game getting absolutely hammered at Ayson Park. And that's why I hated Ayson Park, because it just reminded me of games on Tyne Tees. And this one, as you said, Martin, was after, we got to that. It was a really strange summer. We got to that cup final, and it was like something to build on. And I've wrote about it before that, and I think we talked about it on a previous episode when we played Spurs in early August in a City celebration game. That Sunderland had now become a city, and we were all celebrating this, and we got to the cup final. And this season came along, we had high hopes, and it was just our hopes were just squashed first game of the season away to Swindon. And that was pretty much it. We'd only signed Sean Cunnington and John Colum going into the season. Terry Butcher, as we've already mentioned, he was coaxed out of retirement by Bobby Ferguson. But yeah, this got well into the season, and we were dotting around the bottom, and I think we'd won, 2 of the first 8 games. And we were knocking around 18th in the table. Then we played Millwall at home, beat Millwall. But then we had 2 really tough games. So we had West Ham United, who were relegated, as you said, Martin. And that was away from home on Tyne Tees. Interestingly enough, there was only 10,000 at Upton Park, which shocked me, actually. Talk about West Ham, World Cup champions in 66 and all that sort of stuff. And 10,000 after getting relegated. But I remember watching this.
Watching it for free, Chris. That's why.
Yeah, obviously, yeah, absolutely, because it was on a Sunday. But it was Billy Bonds, and he was under pressure because they weren't doing that great at the time. And I do remember because that after about 20 minutes, and I remember Don Goodman getting a really nasty head wound, and I'm sure it was a clash with Alvin Martin, I remember, because I'm sure Alvin Martin had a bump on his head or something like that. But Alvin Martin came onto the side of the pitch, I think, and he just got a quick bandage or a quick, sponge on the head or whatever it was. Don Goodman, he was covered in blood, and the referee told him he had to go off and he had to go and get stitches. So he goes off after 20 minutes, and when he comes back on 10 minutes later, we're 2-0 down. Kevin Keane and Trevor Morley have put West Ham 2 up. And basically, it just goes wrong from there. Mark Robson gets a couple, Alvin Martin scores, and Martin Allen scores as well. It ends up 6-0 in the end, but it was 5-0 with 5 minutes to go. We get a penalty. Don Goodman misses that, so he's had a fantastic day. But yeah, this game to me, and I vividly remember images from this game in my head, watching it at home. Smells of Sunday dinner and all that sort of stuff in the background, waiting for it to come on. But the other thing as well, because this kind of knocked us back down after winning against Millwall, and then next up, we've already mentioned him, that we had to travel to Newcastle, who have obviously flying high. They won their first 11. I think this was actually the 11th game of the season, because I think they won their first 11 of that season, didn't they? League games. Certainly 10. No, they must have won, because this was the 11th game of the season. So I think they won their first 11 that season off the bounce. And yeah, they had Barry Venison in their team, which Martin's just mentioned as well, and beat us at Roker Park. A Liam O'Brien free kick later on in the game after Gordon Armstrong had equalised. So that was what was to follow our 6-0 defeat. And then after that, I think we dropped down to 19th, and I don't think Malcolm Crosby really ever recovered from that. But this was a big one. And it's funny because, you talk about more managerial moments and what happened. I mean, he lasted until early February, but you can almost pinpoint it to the 10 minutes where Don Goodman goes off, comes back on, 2-0 down. And we can't get any momentum, and yeah, ends up losing his job a few months later. But yeah, this to me, this game just completely sums up that Tyne Tees era, which still gives us nightmares.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I do kind of had similar fond memories of like, oh, Sunday, you're not at school, Sunderland are on the TV, your mum's making like a lovely Sunday dinner and that. And yet the results were just rubbish. The one that sticks in my mind, as you say, I think Tyne Tees just pretty much piggybacked on whichever TV company, whichever franchise happened to be showing Sunderland, because we lost heavily to Brentford. That is the one that for some reason always stuck in my mind. I think it was 3-1 or 4-1 around that time. It was only in the Peter Reid promotion season when suddenly we started doing well. Do you remember, though, in the Premier League years, we had this horrible stat about not winning on a Monday night football
it was a
game
long
for
time, wasn't it?
years. But here's a, if you don't mind, gents, a Tyne Tees question. What was the name of the co-commentator? He was a Middlesbrough. He was an ex-Middlesbrough player. He was a short guy with a mustache.
David Mills.
I thought that was him, but when I've looked at him on Wikipedia and on Google and that, the photos of him, he looked very different to how I remembered him. But if that was him, that puts my mind at ease, because I've been going crazy about it.
That was the first name that sprung to my mind.
Yeah. Well, while you dig that out, Martin, Chris, you're talking about the 0-0 game against Arsenal, which was on, I think that was national rather than, that showed again in that season how unlucky we were to go down, because we gave Arsenal a good game, and I think Arsenal confirmed the title a couple of days later, perhaps.
I think it was that point. I'm sure it was that point that gave them. I'm pretty sure it was that point that gave them the title.
So there you go. There's Sunderland struggling against relegation under Dennis Smith, but on our day we could compete against the very best teams.
And we were awful that day again. Well, like the game was awful against Arsenal, but we were actually the better side that day against Arsenal on television. And I thought at that point it was fun to watch Sunderland on TV, but I was slapped back down again for the next few years. But we weren't great in that first Premier League season either. I remember getting beat against Middlesbrough. I remember getting beat at getting thumped at Chelsea on the TV. And there was a few others that season, but I'm sure the Chelsea home game might have been on Sky actually, where Kevin Ball flew from the halfway line to score that diving header. But yeah, it was a bit mixed. But like you said, it was funny because Peter Reid did change that. I remember the game away to Grimsby Town when Phil Gray scored that one from almost the halfway line later on, and we won 4-1. But it wasn't until that season I actually enjoyed watching. I didn't have to watch us from behind the sofa or from behind my hands or whatever.
I'm gonna make a very Yadar comment here, though. You take it for granted because nowadays every single Sunderland game's available to watch on the TV, whereas then it was a Sunday afternoon treat to see the lads on
it didn't happen very
TV
often.
in your living room. No, it was rare. It was rare.
I was trying to figure out when Chris said about that Arsenal game being the first time he'd watched Sunderland on TV, when the first time I watched Sunderland on TV was. And I reckon it was the FA Cup quarter-final at Chelsea, away at Chelsea, because it was on Sky. And I remember one of my mates I went to school with, he lived in Stanley, and I lived in Black Hill, and he had Sky. He's like one of the only kids at school who had Sky, and he was a mag. He's like, "Oh, come around and watch Sunderland play at night." So I went around to his house to watch the quarter-final.
Because I do think in that 1991 season, I can't remember us being on the big match on the Sunday any other time other than that Arsenal game. And I think it was only because Arsenal could claim the title that day, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because it was the penultimate game of the season that did us. But I was just going to say as well, we also, I don't remember if you remember this, lads, but we had the distinction of being the first ever pay-per-view game as well.
Yeah, Oxford. I paid for it.
The worst game in the
It was a bloody awful game.
0-0 draw. They were seeing if it would work, and they put the worst game in the world on in pay-per-view.
Terrible game to choose. It was David Mills who was the co-commentator on ITV. And I did want to check this before I said it out loud, but he was really seriously injured in a car crash after his playing career finished, but before he started commentating. And he had some facial injuries, which may be why, like, pictures of him from his playing days don't kind of match up with what you remember him seeing on screen.
I just remember him having a tash, and my image of him is very different to those photos, but that might explain it. And Martin, this mate of yours, when he invited you round to watch us play Chelsea, was he secretly hoping we were going to get turned over by them? And then he's gutted because we got a decent result and got a replay out of it. But he was kicking me out the house. I bet he was kicking me out the house afterwards. Don't come back.
His whole family were there. His dad was there. His granddad was there. They invited everybody around. There's a whole room full of mags, and I was the only one jumping up. And actually, to be fair, I think there was a few of them actually celebrating when John Burns scored. And that kind of show. I know we've talked about how the rivalries changed over the course of time, and it was fierce and vicious and all that sort of stuff. But I think there was still a general sort of sense, especially from those older people in those days who had previously gone 1 week to Roker Park, 1 week at St. James's, to kind of see the other one win. As long as they weren't doing better than the other one, who they liked better, there's probably more of a generosity in a local team doing well.
Yeah. In 73, on that subject, I seem to recall seeing adverts that Newcastle Council took out in match day programmes and in newspapers wishing Sunderland well in the cup run. So I know 73 to 92 is still quite it's an almost 20-year gap. But there was that little bit of cordiality between the two.
And now Newcastle fans go mental when Newcastle Airport puts a post up congratulating Sunderland on promotion. But that is another story, and don't look too closely at the ownership of Newcastle Airport if you're a Newcastle fan. We'll go for a quick ad break and we will be back very soon.
Welcome to Sephora.
I'm looking for a perfume that's not too perfumey.
I got you.
Serum moisturizer or moisturizer serum.
Let's get into layering.
My concealer is making me look worse.
Sounds like the wrong shade. Let's get you matched.
There's only one store that really gets what you're going for. Get beauty from people who get beauty. Only at Sephora.
Hi, Let's get you a basket.
Jif peanut butter. It's that jiffing good, it doesn't really need advertising. So instead, enjoy the calming sounds of the ocean. Jif. Ooh, it's that jiffing good. Get your Jif at jif.com.
Welcome back to We're the podcast for our final day of this week. This is October the 12th. And in 1895, Chris, there was a game against Queen's Park, I believe, which you watched live on TV.
Yes, I got Kelvin to tell me all about it. So he gave me the lowdown. He gave me the notes for today. You can cut that later, Martin. It's fine. All the way back to 1895. We talked about it earlier on. I can't remember which one of you mentioned it, but obviously James Allen, Scottish teacher, founded the club, and of course, back in the English Civil War, Sunderland was a garrison of the Scottish Army. So a lot of Scottish links going back, and those early sides as well. It was full of Scottish players who kind of ended up taking us into the Football League, as we talked about before. And I talked about a game that we played early doors against Celtic. I think it was in the 30s, and how many kind of Scots we had in that, and the early games as well, that we were just full of Scottish players. But obviously in these early days, it was we were playing a lot of friendly games, and we played a series of games against Queen's Park FC, which who are quite important when it comes to, we talked about the goalkeeper earlier on. It was important to how football kind of got structured. And Queen's Park are a famous club in Scotland, and they were named after a local ground where they practiced, which was called Queen's Park, of course. And they provided all the Scottish players for the first international between England and Scotland, which happened in 1872. The West of Scotland Cricket Club, after the game was getting more popular. It was also the first club to adopt the association rules outside of England and Wales. And they kind of obviously adopted that. It was the old Etonian rules alongside the Sheffield rules that came in. But they started to, England was still in kind of a little bit of a rugby mode in the early days. And, that Queen's Park were one of the first to start playing football on the ground rather than lump it in the air. And they were starting to play almost skillful football, if you like. And they were kind of insisting on a 2-player offside rule and all of this. They also refused to allow tripping or hacking in their early games. And they were eliminating a fair catch or making a mark, which actually is, you see now in rugby union and the Australian rules. So they started to turn, in those real early days, football away from rugby, and they were kind of making that kind of early distinction. But yeah, and they were talking about, they were apparently kind of way ahead of the curve in terms of actually training and doing passing and dribbling. And there was got a quote here from someone, Richard Robinson, who did the club's official history, and he was going back and he was saying, in these games, the dribbling and passing, which raised the Scottish game to a level of a fine art, were developed. Dribbling was a characteristic of the English player, and it wasn't until very much later that the Southern teams came to see that the principles laid down by the Queen's Park method of transference of the ball, as placed by strong backing up, were those which got most out of the team. And so they did what they called combinations, which obviously, you go now and go, you look at the likes of Pep Guardiola, and the game is almost choreographed to the nth degree, where you pass to him, he passes, you move here. But it was Queen's Park back in the day who kind of started all that up. And originally, Queen's Park joined the English Football Association and regularly played in the English FA Cup. But actually, just very quickly, quiz question for you at this point. Do you know what the oldest soccer trophy is that's still in existence?
But still in existence, that physically exists, or it's still competed for?
Physically exists.
Oh.
Well, I hope it's got something to do with Queen's Park, because otherwise you've thrown us a massive googly here.
Yeah, well, it could be the Mexican championship trophy.
Well, it's actually to do with this. Well, the timing of this game, because the oldest soccer trophy still in existence is the Scottish FA Cup, which started up around this time, and Queen's Park had a big place in that. It's because a month before this friendly was played on this day in 1895, that the original FA Cup went missing and was never found again. So they had to replace it and have a replacement for it. But yeah, that so we travelled up for we travelled up for a friendly in 1895. And as I said, they played at Hampden Park, of course, and they did. I'm sure they only changed just recently. I might be wrong on that. But they started to develop Hampden Park, and it happened in stages. But it just so happened that Queen's Park played there from the beginning. So when Scotland played internationals there, that they played there. But yeah, on this occasion, we went up and the lads won 5-2. So it was only 7,000 in attendance, but it's amazing when you do think about it, the links, and we talked about James Allen, but in those early days, it was essentially Scottish players and a Scottish person who got us off the ground. And, Kelvin, this is I suppose a tribute to Kelvin, who's not with us today, but yeah, that, our links with Scotland, and Kelvin always talks about them. We love a trip up when we play teams, Hearts this summer, and quite regularly our friendlies up there. So yeah, lots of links with Scotland, and this one was with their oldest club, Queen's Park, who again, like we talked about earlier, when you listen and read about how the game developed, played a massive part in it.
Good stuff. We will crack on with October the 12th. 1954, Jackie Ashurst was born. 14 years later, Seth Irwin scored his only goal for Sunderland in over 350 appearances in a 3-1 win over Forest at Roker Park. 1988, now we talked about West Ham away game just moments ago. We played West Ham away on this day in 1988. It was a League Cup. We got beat 2-1. I think it was the first leg of a League Cup tie. David Kelly, who just signed for West Ham from Walsall, scored one of the goals. a lad called Gary Ogilvie came off the bench to make his debut for Sunderland. Now, he only made 3 appearances, all as sub for us. He was a young Scottish defender. He went to Airdrie, I think maybe at the end of that season. He only played about 8 games, but he had a long career as a policeman. He was a chief inspector at Dundee. Now, I found a newspaper article from 2015, where he was a chief inspector. He was talking about something or other going on, some initiative. But then he packed in being a policeman, got back into football, and was head of recruitment at Dundee for a few years. And I think he only left that post at the end of last season. I think it looks as if he's still involved with Dundee, but maybe in different roles. So it's quite a bit of a turnaround. 40 odd years later, he's gone back into football. 1991. Now this is one of those things that you look at and go, did that really happen? We got beat 3-0 away at Cambridge. It was an awful game. This was when Marco Gabbiadini had left. We were trying to find a solution to that gap that had been left in his wake. And Dennis Smith chucked Gary Bennett up front in the number 10 shirt to see if that would work. And it didn't. So he didn't try it again. But yes, a 3-0 away defeat. I think it was John Becker who was the manager of Cambridge at the time. It was not a very nice day out.
Just quickly, it does look like, I'm looking at the team, it does look like he tried to play Gary Bennett and Tony Cullen up front for that game, which might have signalled the end of Dennis Smith, to be fair. And the other thing, a couple of other things on that, Dion Dublin scored for Cambridge, because I think this was the season, at the end of this season, he went to Man United.
That's right.
But just looking at the notes on StatCat, Steve Smelt was apparently booked on the hour mark for trying to tend to Peter Bakery's injury, but he wasn't given permission to come on. So, felt by Smelt went wrong on this occasion.
I'm going to say it's the best name for a column in the football programme, isn't it? Felt by Smelt. 1999, Michael Reddy made his debut for Sunderland. We played Wimbledon away in a League Cup game and went to extra time. We got beat 3-2. Carl Court scored a hat-trick for Wimbledon. I think Egil Olsen was their manager, but Kevin Ball got a goal back for us in the very last minute, but too late, and we went out of the League Cup. But for our final little thing that we're going to concentrate on today, we're going to go back just 6 years after the game Chris was talking about, actually, at Queen's Park, to 1901, and a victory, Andrew, over Sheffield United.
Yes, when I was looking into this game, I thought I was delving back into the far reaches of history, but Chris has trumped me there. I just wanted to go random, lads, and just picked a game I knew nothing about. So I ended up going for the 1901-02 season, which ended in success for us. That season saw us winning our 4th Football League title. The year before that, we had the one hand on the trophy, but then in the penultimate game, we lost to, they weren't Sheffield Wednesday then, they were simply the Wednesday. And I think in this following season, the club were just determined not to make that same mistake again. They started fairly strongly and stayed up near the top throughout. So yeah, as I say, we'd started strongly. Going into the 12th of October, we just beat the Mags 1-0 and we'd just beaten Aston Villa 1-0, so there was a bit of confidence around the team. Against Villa, we had a lad making his debut for us called Fred Mearns. He was from Deptford, so he was a local lad. He was a very good goalkeeper by all accounts, and he played well in this Aston Villa game. But when you are understudy to Ted Doig, it's not enough, is it? You know, Ted Doig had been out with a minor knee injury from training, but he was back fit again, so he came straight back into the team for this Sheffield United match. The team was otherwise unchanged, so you had Doig in goal, you had Andy McCombie playing. Now, he's a player we've mentioned a few times because he went to Newcastle and was involved in, it was quite bitter, his departure from Sunderland to Newcastle, shall we say. Alongside him was Jimmy Watson. Then we had Matthew Ferguson, Sandy McAllister and Dickie Jackson playing. Matthew Ferguson's a really sad story. I don't know if you remember us mentioning him before, but he was captain for the majority of this season. He lifted a trophy And then about 3 or 4 weeks after that, he passes away with illness. So that was obviously a tragic story. Our forwards were Billy Hogg and Bobby Hogg, who were not related. And it was very complicated back in the day trying to look at match reports of those two because they both had the initial B. So picking out which one was which was tough. Alongside them in the forwards was Jamie Miller, Jimmy Gemmell, and Colin McClatchy. As I say, we were going into the game on the back of a couple of wins. We'd already beaten Sheffield United on the opening day of the season as well, so that was a bit of a confidence boost going into the game at Bramall Lane. The conditions for October were quite good as well, so that was in our favour. Despite that, the match itself, gents, was quite scrappy. Both teams did try to play nice football, but often that final pass or final decision just lacked a bit of quality, and I think it was quite a frustrating game to watch. Certainly when the report I dug out from the Sunderland Daily Echo and Shipping Gazette, as it was back then, seemed to think that it could have been a lot better had the final ball been decent. In the first half, after what the Echo described as a prolonged bully of the Sunderland goal, which I assume means we were under pressure, Doig was beaten, but McCombie was on the goal line to make a clearance and concede a corner, so we got away with that one. It was the clearest chance either side had in the first half, but then in the second half after the break, we just stepped it up a level and started really pinning Sheffield United in. Do either of you know of a goalkeeper called, quite cruelly, called Fatty Folk?
Yes.
Have you ever? Yeah.
I do remember reading about him.
Yeah, quite a famous name from back in the day, bless him. I mean, being nicknamed Fatty isn't too pleasant. Although when you see photos of him alongside his teammates, he was just a giant. He towered over them as well. But his proper name was William. So William Folk was this well-known goalkeeper. We were really testing him in the second half. He had to produce a lot of good saves, although sadly for him, it was actually his error that led to the only goal of the game. About 17, 18 minutes into the second half, he's tried to punch the ball away. He's not got a good connection on it. So the ball's just dropped for Gemmell to smash into the net. And that was it. 1-0 up. We had most of the play after that. Doig wasn't really tested. Now you think if somebody's just come back into the team, having had a knee injury, you might be trying to pepper him with shots, but we were able to keep United at arm's length for the main and secure the win. In fairness to the hosts, they were weakened by what was described as accident and illness, which again, if we translate to modern day, I assume accident means injuries. So they weren't at the best, but, you know, Sunderland did what eventual title-winning teams do. They were rock solid, and they won the game with minimum of fuss, you know, which is what you want. It was our third consecutive 1-0 win, and it took us outright top for the first time that season. We followed it up with a hammering of Nottingham Forest. We beat them 4-0, so we really are starting to mean business at that point. We've got over the disappointment of not winning the championship the previous season. And as a nice treat for the players for beating Sheffield United, they were invited by the management of the Avenue Theatre that week to attend a showing of a musical comedy called Kitty Grey. Apparently, when they took their seats in the theatre, it was a musical comedy. This show, it had been adapted from a straight play originally, and somebody had added music to it that included a full chorus and increased orchestra. But despite that, the players were the star attraction seemingly, because when they took the seats in the theatre, everybody around them got up off their feet and started applauding them and gave them a good reception. So that was a nice little treat for them as a bonus for winning. And the Avenue Theatre, I thought I recognised it, so I did a bit of digging. Seemingly, it later became a cinema rather than a theatre, but in the 1930s it was bought by Vaux breweries, and they built around the theatre. So the main entrance of the theatre remained part of the large Vaux site in the middle of town. So when I looked at the photo, Chris, of the theatre back in its original purpose, I thought that the front of the building looks familiar. And sure enough, when you then look at photos of Vaux Brewery, you can still tell the distinctive part of the wall then became part of the wider Vaux site. And if you can't picture exactly where that was, where I'm talking about, it's in the area just opposite where the Magistrates Court is now in Keele Square. And it was apparently the place to go when you were flying high, top of the Football League, and you wanted to enjoy yourselves and relax with a nice entertaining night watching a show called Kitty Grey. So there you go. Well done, Sunderland. They won at Sheffield United all those years ago, and it helped them go on to win the title at the end of the season.
Excellent, top man. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. I think it's quite amusing that we've often blamed Kelvin for our very long podcast, and we managed to clock up 2.5 hours without him. So
another short one.
I think we'll just have to accept responsibility. Is equally shared, I suppose. But thank you to everyone who's stuck with us today. Thank you for listening, and please do get in touch if we have stirred up any memories, positive or more likely negative, today. And it's always excellent to hear from you, so you can leave comments on the podcast app on Spotify or on the website, or send us an email at howaythepodcast@safc@gmail.com. Now, Andrew, we started off this episode with the quiz from last week, which, of course, was Jimmy Montgomery. And have you got a quiz to tempt the listeners and whet the appetite for next week's On This Week?
I do, yes, but very quickly, Kelvin is absolved of any blame because I am going to extend this pod for a moment, if you don't mind, lads. Just before going into the quiz question.
Are you going to sing?
I'm going to sing us out to a number from the famous Kitty Grey production at the Avenue Theatre all those years ago. No, just a couple of points I want to say, because I don't know what it is about me, but I have to get these off my chest, otherwise I'll go mad. Brian Marwood, you mentioned earlier on, yes, Martin. So I did a little bit of digging on Brian Marwood. I thought this was the case. He never got to wear red and white for Sunderland, but he was at Nike when Sunderland were wearing.
That's right, yes.
Yeah. So he did have a bit of involvement. He never got to pull on a shirt for real, but he did have a bit of involvement in one of Nike's contracts with the club. And just another kit-related thing, we talked about that win at Bradford in 2018 where there was sendings off and max power, and we won 2-1. Technically, on that day, the shirt we had was a one-off, because that season, our away kit would have clashed with Bradford's shirt. Our home shirt, for whatever reason, the referee didn't like the idea of us wearing red and white. So we were in a bit of a fix, and what we had to do was dig out some away kits from the previous season from the back of the cupboard, presumably. They were just gathering dust or whatever. We changed sponsor, though, so we quickly had to put the new sponsor on this old design. And strictly speaking, this was a one-off shirt for that day, because we never wore that light blue combination with that sponsor. So I just had to get those off my chest. I don't know. I want to say, is it because I'm quite anal, or is that something completely different? And I have...
different podcast altogether.
Yeah. But anyway, there you go. Thanks for indulging us. The quiz question, back to your original point. We've touched on 2 massive Sunderland birthdays in this episode. We spoke about Montgomery and also Niall Quinn, who enjoyed his birthday in this period. So we're going to go for another major figure in Sunderland history when we record 13th to the 19th of October next time. That will include a club legend who was born in Silksworth on the 13th of October. Again, I'm going low on clues because this fella is one of the best known names in Sunderland history. And if you are struggling to think of who it is, if you happen to be in Silksworth over the next few days, just past the Golden Fleece, because there's a dirty, great big mural of him, and that will give the game away. So yeah, whose birthday is it on the 13th of October? A Sunderland legend from Silksworth.
Excellent. Right, we will be back tomorrow as we take the opportunity to reflect on Sunderland's start of the season and look a little bit further ahead to what lies in store for the rest of 2025. And of course, we'll be back next Monday for another episode of On This Week. But until then, it's goodbye from us.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Sports Social Podcast Network, the biggest voices in sport. Let's take a look at some of the lineup. Tops and tails.
And he goes, all right, mate, do you want the darts? And thing, and I'm like, what darts?
The Anfield Wrap.
Off the field, Liverpool have done everything they possibly could to achieve dominance now.
The Analyst Inside Cricket.
It was announced over the PA system that I was out of the test for injury. A massive cheer went up around the ground. Probably the biggest cheer I've got in the UK.
All on Europe's biggest sport podcast network. Find your next favourite sport podcast. Search Sports Social Podcast Network and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Verified comparison at content.sport-social.co.uk/comparison.